Of course, here are a few engaging intro options for your story, each with a slightly different focus. Option 1. Focus on the central metaphor. Alara Vance was a master at mending stories. In her workshop, she could resurrect the most broken-spined book, giving it a future. But the story of her own life felt irreparable. At 32, the chapter on love remained stubbornly, achingly blank, and after another soulless date, she was beginning to wonder if she was a book destined to remain unfinished. Option 2. Focus on the relatable problem. For book restorer Alara Vance, loneliness was a constant companion, especially after a disastrous date with a man who was more spreadsheet than soul. She had a life filled with beautiful, old things, but her own story felt hollow. She was tired of searching for a connection in a world of data points, longing for a love that felt less like a checklist and more like coming home. Option 3. Focus on the turning point. After years of searching and a string of disastrous dates, Alara Vance gives up on her own plans. In a moment of quiet desperation, she kneels and hands the unwritten love story of her life over to God. She doesn't expect a lightning bolt or a sign from the heavens. She certainly doesn't expect the answer to walk into her bookshop the very next day, holding a broken family Bible and a history that might just be the beginning of her own. Chapter 1. The Weight of an Unwritten Page. The silence in Alara Vance's apartment was a physical entity. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of solitude. It was the hollow, echoing silence of absence. It pooled in the corners of her small living room, clung to the spines of the hundreds of books lining her shelves, and settled most heavily in the empty chair across from her at the small dining table. Tonight, that silence felt particularly loud, seasoned as it was with the lingering ghost of another disastrous date. His name was Mark. On paper, he was perfect. A successful financial analyst with a portfolio as impressive as his crisp, white shirt. He had a good smile, a firm handshake, and an encyclopedic knowledge of artisanal coffee beans. He had ticked every box on the theoretical checklist Alara's well-meaning friends had helped her compile over wine and sympathetic sighs. Asterisk stable. Ambitious. Kindish. Good teeth. Asterisk. Yet, sitting across from him in the aggressively modern restaurant, with its concrete walls and single, dramatic flower on each table, Alara had felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if she were watching a film of her own life starring an actress who couldn't quite remember her lines. Mark had talked at her, a monologue of stock market trends, marathon training times, and his recent, very strategic, acquisition of a Scandinavian minimalist sofa. He asked her questions, but his eyes glazed over before she could finish her answers, already formulating his next data point. He was a collection of impressive attributes, but not a person. Not to her, anyway. There was no story in his eyes, no shared language in their pauses. She had tried. She had asked about his passion for running, hoping to find a flicker of a soul behind the statistics of his personal bests. It's about efficiency of movement and cardiovascular optimization, he'd explained, as if describing a piece of machinery. Now, hours later, the memory of his clinical explanation of joy was a bitter taste in her mouth, far more potent than the lukewarm tea she cradled in her hands. At 32, Alara felt like one of the old books she so lovingly restored in her downtown workshop, The Gilded Page. From the outside, the cover was still good. She had a life she had meticulously built, a passion that paid the bills, a cozy apartment that felt like a hug, and 2 or 3 friends who were as dear to her as family. But inside, a crucial page felt missing. Or perhaps it had never been written. The chapter on shared love, on true partnership, remained achingly, starkly blank. She wasn't desperate. That was the word people used, the word she loathed. It implied a frantic, undignified grasping. Alara wasn't grasping. She was waiting. She had been waiting with a patient, hopeful heart for years. She'd gone on the blind dates, swiped on the apps until her thumb was sore and her spirit was bruised, and joined the co-ed volleyball league despite her distinct lack of athletic prowess. She had put herself out there, as the advice columns urged, only to find that out there was a landscape of men like Mark, collections of data points, or men who were still nursing wounds from their last relationship, or men who simply weren't looking for the same thing she was. What was she looking for? The question hung in the quiet air of her apartment. It wasn't a checklist anymore. She'd mentally torn that list to shreds tonight. It was a feeling. It was the quiet comfort of reading in the same room with someone without the need to speak. It was the shared laughter over a stupid joke that no one else would get. It was the steady presence of a hand to hold when the world felt unsteady. It was a spiritual harmony, a meeting of souls who recognized each other on a level deeper than resumes and hobbies. It was a love that felt less like a conquest and more like coming home. A tear, hot and unexpected, escaped and traced a path down her cheek. She didn't bother to wipe it away. It was a tear of pure, unadulterated loneliness. It was a grief for a love she had never known but missed with an intensity that hollowed out her chest. She stood up, the chair scraping softly against the polished wood floor. Her reflection in the dark window pane was a pale, somber ghost. Weariness was etched around her eyes, a fine filigree of disappointment. She saw not just herself, but the accumulated weight of all the hopeful first dates that led to nowhere, all the polite, "let's just be friends" texts, all the nights spent watching romantic comedies and feeling a pang of something close to envy. She walked through her small apartment, her fingertips trailing over the familiar spines of Austen and Bronte, of poets who wrote of love with such certainty. Her workshop, the Gilded Page, was her sanctuary, a place of quiet purpose. There, with the scent of old paper, leather, and binding glue in the air, she could mend what was broken. She could take a tattered, forgotten volume, a book whose spine was cracked and whose pages were threatening to escape, and with patient, skilled hands, make it whole again. She could reinforce the spine, clean the foxing from the pages, and re-gild the faded letters on the cover. She gave stories a future, but she couldn't seem to do the same for her own. Her path led her not to the bookshelf, but to the small, kneeling prayer bench tucked into a corner of her bedroom. It had been her grandmother's, a simple piece of dark oak with a worn, embroidered cushion. Alara hadn't used it in months, maybe long. Oh, her faith, once a central pillar of her life, had become like a beautiful, old book she admired on a shelf, but rarely opened. She went to church on Sundays, her voice joining the chorus of hymns, her mind often drifting to her weekly to-do list. Her prayers had become rote, a recitation of thanks and vague requests for guidance. She hadn't truly prayed, with the raw, desperate vulnerability of a soul laid bare, in a very long time. It felt too exposing, too much like admitting she couldn't fix this one essential broken thing in her own life. Tonight, the pride that kept her from such vulnerability had crumbled. The carefully constructed walls of self-sufficiency were gone, washed away by that single, hot tear. The silence of her apartment was no longer just an absence. It was an invitation. She sank to her knees, the old wood creaking a familiar welcome. The texture of the embroidered cushion was rough beneath her knees. She didn't clasp her hands in a neat, pious steeple. She simply rested her forearms on the rail and bowed her head, letting the full weight of her loneliness, her fatigue, her yearning, press down on her. For a long moment, she said nothing. The words were a tangled knot in her throat. Where did one even begin? God, I'm so tired. That was the first truth that surfaced. Lord, she whispered, her voice husky and unused to this kind of raw pleading. I don't know what to do anymore. The admission hung in the air, fragile and real. I've tried, she continued, the words coming faster now, a torrent held back for too long. I really have. I've tried to be smart about it, to be practical. I've tried to be open-hearted. I've been on more coffee dates than I can count. I've listened to men talk about their jobs and their ex-wives and their fantasy football leagues, and I've tried so hard to find a connection, a spark, something real. She paused, taking a shaky breath. And I'm just empty. It feels like I'm searching for a song I've never heard, but I know exactly what it's supposed to sound like. And all I hear is static. Tears began to fall freely now, dotting the dark wood of the prayer bench. They weren't tears of self-pity, but of surrender. I don't want to do this on my own anymore. I'm giving it to you. This ache in my heart, this longing for a partner, this empty space beside me, it's yours. I am so tired of trying to fill it myself. She thought of the checklists, the strategies, the endless analysis with her friends. All of it felt like human hubris, like trying to architect a miracle. I'm not going to give you a list of qualifications, she said, a small, watery laugh escaping her lips. You know my heart better than I do. You knit me together. You know the story you are writing for me. So I'm just asking, if it is your will, if there is a man out there you have created for me, and me for him, please, guide our paths together. She closed her eyes, trying to picture not a face, but a feeling. Send me a man of faith, she prayed, the words becoming clearer, more certain. A man with a kind and gentle heart. Someone who laughs easily and often. Someone who sees the world with a sense of wonder. A man who isn't afraid of quiet moments, who values conversation that goes deeper than the surface. She pictured her workshop, the delicate work of her hands. Send me someone who understands the beauty of old things, who has patience and a reverence for the past. Someone who isn't trying to build a life out of shiny, new, disposable things, but who wants to build something that lasts. Something with history and meaning. A partner, she breathed. A true partner. My friend. My companion. My soulmate. Someone to walk beside, to serve you with, to build a home with that is filled with love and grace and peace. The torrent of words slowed to a quiet stream. The desperation was washing out of her, replaced by a strange and profound calm. The final, most crucial piece of the prayer settled in her heart. But if this is not your plan for me, she whispered, the words tasting of both fear and freedom, then please, Lord, heal this longing. Fill this space in me with yourself. Give me the grace to be whole and content in the life you have given me. Let my story be one of your love alone, if that is what you wish. She bowed her head lower, pressing her forehead against her clasped hands. I surrender it all. My timing, my expectations, my desires. I place them in your hands. Thy will be done. She stayed there for a long time, kneeling in the quiet dark of her bedroom. The silence was different now. It was no longer a hollow absence. It was a peaceful, expectant hush. The weight in her chest had lifted, replaced by a lightness she hadn't felt in years. She had handed over the heaviest book in her library, the one she didn't know how to mend, to the master restorer. She finally rose, her knees stiff but her spirit serene. She slept more deeply that night than she had in months, a dreamless, peaceful slumber. The next few days passed in a haze of this newfound peace. The gnawing anxiety that usually accompanied a quiet Friday night was gone. The pang of seeing a happy couple walk hand in hand down the street was replaced by a gentle, genuine smile. Something had shifted within her. By releasing her white-knuckled grip on the outcome, she had been given the gift of the present moment. Her work at the Gilded Page became her meditation. On Monday morning, the crisp autumn air followed her into the shop, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. The little bell above the door tinkled a cheerful greeting. Sunlight streamed through the large front window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, golden sprites. The shop was her haven, a world of ordered beauty. Books were stacked in careful towers, tools were laid out in precise rows, and the rich, complex aroma of history permeated everything. She spent the morning meticulously repairing the spine of a first-edition copy of Sense and Sensibility. Her fingers, nimble and sure, worked the waxed linen thread through the original sewing stations, her mind completely absorbed in the task. This was what she was good at, bringing things back from the brink of being lost. Around noon, she was carefully applying a thin layer of leather conditioner to the book's dry, cracking cover when the bell above the door chimed again. She looked up, a polite, professional smile already on her lips. A man stood just inside the doorway, blinking as his eyes adjusted to the dimmer light of the shop. He was tall, but he didn't dominate the space. He held himself with a kind of gentle stillness. He had warm, dark eyes that seemed to be taking in every detail of her shop with genuine curiosity, not just a cursory glance. He was wearing a simple gray Henley jeans, and a stray lock of dark brown hair had fallen across his forehead. He wasn't classically handsome, in the way Mark had been, all sharp angles and polished symmetry. His was a kinder, more approachable face, etched with laugh lines around his eyes that suggested a life of genuine amusement. He was holding something in his hands, wrapped carefully in a soft, flannel cloth. "Hello," he said, his voice a pleasant baritone, calm and unhurried. "I was told this was the best place in the city for delicate work." "I do my best," Alara replied, her smile becoming more natural. She wiped her hands on her canvas apron. "What have you brought me?" He walked toward her workbench, his steps quiet and respectful, as if he understood he was in a sacred space. He placed the bundled object on the counter and began to unwrap it with a reverence that immediately caught Alara's attention. Revealed from within the cloth was a book. But it was more than a book. It was an artifact, a relic. It was a large, leather-bound family Bible, its cover worn smooth with the passage of countless hands. The corners were frayed, the leather was cracked and peeling, and the spine was completely broken, held together by a desperate, failing piece of old masking tape. The gilt lettering on the front was so faded it was barely legible, but she could just make out the words, "Holy Bible." "Wow," Alara breathed, her professional curiosity instantly piqued. She leaned closer, her fingers hovering over the damaged cover, not yet touching. "This has seen a lot of life. It's been in my family for generations," the man explained. "My great-great-grandfather brought it over from Scotland. It's seen births, deaths, marriages, all recorded inside." He gestured to the front pages, which she could see were filled with elegant, looping calligraphy, now faded to a pale brown. "The spine finally gave out completely last week. I opened it, and it just split." The pain in his voice was evident. It wasn't just a broken object to him. It was a broken connection. "I can see that," Alara said, her voice soft with empathy. "These old bindings, they become brittle over time. The leather dries out, the glue perishes." She finally allowed her fingertips to ghost over the surface. She felt an immediate connection to the object, to the history it contained. This was the kind of work she lived for. Not just a repair, but a resurrection. "Do you think, can anything be done?" he asked, his dark eyes filled with a hopeful vulnerability that struck a chord deep within her. "Oh, yes," Alara said, a confident energy infusing her voice. "Absolutely. It's a big job, but it's very doable. I'll need to completely disbind it, treat the leather, repair the tears on the individual pages, and then resew the signatures and build a whole new spine, incorporating the original boards if they're salvageable." Which they looked to be. As she spoke, she noticed he was listening with an intense, focused interest. He wasn't just waiting for a price quote. He was absorbing the process, appreciating the craft. "Signatures?" he asked. "It's what we call the folded groups of pages that are sewn together to make up the book block," she explained, pointing to the exposed gatherings of paper along the broken spine. "Each one of these is a signature." "I never knew that," he said, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face. It transformed him. The laugh lines around his eyes deepened, and his entire demeanor radiated warmth. "It's like every part of it has a name, a purpose." "Everything does," Alara agreed, meeting his smile. An easy silence fell between them as she continued her assessment, gently lifting the cover to inspect the end papers. He didn't rush her. He simply watched, his presence calm and reassuring. It was a completely different kind of silence than the one she'd shared with Mark. This was a comfortable silence, a shared space of mutual respect. "My name is Julian, by the way," he said, extending a hand over the counter. "Alara," she replied, taking it. His hand was warm and strong, his grip firm but gentle. His calluses spoke of manual work, of someone who created things with his hands. "Alara," he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. "That's a beautiful name, like something out of one of these books." She felt a blush creep up her neck, a warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. "Thank you. And thank you for trusting me with this, Julian. It's a treasure. I knew from the moment I walked in here that it was the right place," he said, his gaze sweeping around the shop again. "You can feel the care in this room. It's not just a business, is it?" "No," she said, her heart swelling with a quiet pride. "It's my life's work." "I understand that," he said, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that he truly did. "I'm a luthier." "A luthier?" "I make and repair stringed instruments. Mostly violins and cellos," he explained. "I spend my days with old wood and varnish, trying to bring a voice back to something that has fallen silent. So, I recognize a kindred spirit when I see one. A luthier. It was perfect. A restorer of books and a restorer of instruments. Both of them, guardians of old, beautiful things. Both of them, dedicating their lives to preserving story and song." A thrill, quiet and profound, ran through her. They spent another 20 minutes talking, ostensibly about the Bible, the type of leather she would use, the process of reinforcing the paper, but the conversation spiraled outwards. They talked about the smell of old wood, the satisfaction of a perfect join, the way an object could hold the memory and energy of the people who had loved it. It was the easiest, most natural conversation she had had with a stranger in years. There was no pretense, no agenda. It was just two people sharing a passion for their craft. Finally, after she had written up a detailed work order, he reluctantly prepared to leave. "I'll take the best possible care of it," she promised, looking from his earnest face to the precious book on her counter. "I have no doubt about that," he said. He lingered for a moment, a hesitant smile on his lips. "Well, I'll let you get back to it. I'll call you in a week or so with an update," she said, trying to keep her voice professional, even. "I'd like that." He walked to the door, turning back once he was there. "Thank you again, Alara." "You're welcome, Julian." The bell chimed his departure, and then the shop was quiet again. But the silence was different. It was not the hollow silence of before, nor even the peaceful silence of her morning's work. It was a thrumming, resonant silence, the kind of quiet that follows a beautiful piece of music. Alara stood at her workbench for a long time, her hand resting on the cover of the old, broken Bible. She looked at its tattered cover, its fractured spine, and its pages filled with the history of a family. A project of restoration. A project of faith. A slow, wondering smile touched her lips. She, though, thought of her prayer, kneeling in the dark, asking for a man who understood the beauty of old things, a man with a kind and gentle heart, a man who would build something that lasts. She had asked God to guide their paths together. She hadn't been looking for an answer to her prayer to walk through the door of her shop on a sunny Monday afternoon, holding a broken Bible. She had expected a sign, perhaps, a feeling, a vague sense of hope. She had not expected a man named Julian with warm, kind eyes and a luthier's hands. It was too soon to know anything. It was just a conversation, a professional encounter. It could mean nothing. But as she stood in the golden afternoon light of her sanctuary, a feeling of profound and joyful peace settled over her. It was the feeling of a story whose first page had just, unexpectedly and miraculously, been written. She didn't know how the chapter would end, but for the first time in a very long time, She was not afraid of the blank pages to come. She felt, with a certainty that hummed in her very soul, that she was no longer writing this story alone. The author had just introduced a new character. Chapter 2. The Language of Mending. For a long time after the bell above the door announced Julian's departure, Alara remained perfectly still, her hand resting on the warm, worn cover of his family's Bible. The silence that filled the gilded page was no longer an adversary. It had transformed. It was now a vessel, holding the resonance of his voice, the memory of his warm smile, and the quiet, thrumming potential of a shared understanding. The afternoon sun slanted through the front window, illuminating the floating dust motes not as signs of neglect, but as a golden, dancing confetti celebrating a moment of unexpected grace. She finally drew a deep, steadying breath, the air fragrant with the familiar sense of old paper, leather, and binding glue. These were the smells of her sanctuary, but today they seemed richer, more vibrant. She looked down at the book beneath her hand. It was, objectively, a wreck. A beautiful, historical, sentimental wreck. Its spine was a chasm, its pages a fragile diaspora waiting to happen. To an untrained eye, it was a lost cause. To Alara, it was a promise. It was the most hopeful object she had touched in years. With the reverence of an archaeologist handling a priceless artifact, she began her work. The first step was always diagnosis, a slow and intimate examination. She carried the Bible to her largest workbench, cleared of all other projects, and laid it on a soft cradle of archival foam. Her tools, gleaming and precise, lay in their neat rows on a leather roll beside her. Bone folders with edges worn smooth by use, slender scalpels, delicate brushes made of badger hair, a surgeon's array for the maladies of books. She photographed every detail of its brokenness, documenting the state of the cover, the faded gilt, the torn end papers, the tragic state of the spine. Then, she opened it, ever so carefully. The pages, brittle with age, exhaled a dry, sweet scent, the ghost of 100 years of hands turning them, of lamplight and quiet reading. The first few leaves were a genealogy, a tapestry of lives woven in ink. * William Anderson, born Aberdeenshire, 1868. Married to Elspeth MacGregor, 1891. First son, Thomas, born 1893. The script changed with each generation, from the elegant, spidery copperplate of the 19th century to the more familiar, rounded cursive of the mid-20th. Names were recorded, dates of birth and death, marriages that bound families together. Julian's name was there, near the bottom, written in a steady, modern hand. Julian Thomas Anderson, born 1990. A strange, protective warmth bloomed in her chest. She wasn't just mending a book. She was being entrusted with a family's heart, their chronicle of joy and sorrow. The weight of it was immense, but it was a good weight, a purposeful weight. This was the work she was made for. Over the next few days, her life took on a new rhythm, centered around the Anderson Bible. The process of disbinding was a delicate deconstruction. With a small, sharp knife, she carefully sliced the remaining threads holding the signatures together. Each cluster of pages, once freed, was a small victory. As she worked, her mind replayed her conversation with Julian. A luthier, she imagined his hands, the same hands that had held this Bible, moving with practiced skill over the curved body of a cello, coaxing wood and varnish and string into a vessel for music. He didn't just fix things, he restored their voice. She felt the kinship between their crafts like a current running through her. They were both practitioners of the art of mending, believers in the enduring beauty of things made to last. The thought was a dangerous one. It was a seed of hope planted in soil that had been barren for a very long time. Part of her, the weary, cynical part forged in the fires of 100 bad dates, wanted to douse it with cold water. He's just a client. A nice client, but that's all. Don't build a fantasy around a man you've met once. Asterisk. She remembered Mark, the financial analyst, and his talk of cardiovascular optimization. He had looked at the world and seen a series of data points to be analyzed and mastered. Julian, in their brief meeting, had looked at her shop and seen a sanctuary. He had looked at an old book and seen his family's heart. The contrast was so stark it was almost comical. On Thursday, she reached a critical stage in the restoration. She had collated all the signatures in their correct order and was beginning the painstaking process of mending the individual pages. A few had significant tears that required delicate work with Japanese tissue paper, a material so thin it was almost invisible once applied with wheat starch paste. As she laid a gossamer thin piece over a tear on a page in the Book of Psalms, her phone buzzed on the workbench. Her heart gave a ridiculous, adolescent leap when she saw the unknown number. It could be anyone. A supplier. A wrong number. A robocall about her car's extended warranty. She wiped her hands meticulously on a cloth, took a sip of cool water, and answered with a professional calm she did not feel. The gilded page. This is Alara. Hello, Alara. It's Julian Anderson. His voice. It was just as she remembered. A calm, warm baritone that seemed to smooth out the frayed edges of the world. It was a voice that belonged to quiet workshops and thoughtful conversation. Julian. Hello, she said, a smile breaking across her face despite her attempt at professional composure. I was just working on your family's Bible this very moment. I hope I'm not interrupting, he said. Not at all. I was just mending a tear in Psalm 23. It felt strangely intimate to tell him that. There was a pause on the line, a comfortable one. The Lord is my shepherd, he said, his voice soft. My grandmother used to read that one to M.E. She had the whole thing memorized. It's a beautiful passage, Alara said, her fingers tracing the words on the page. Your grandmother had good taste. She did. In Psalms and in grandsons, he said, and she could hear the gentle humor in his tone. Listen, the reason I'm calling. I know you said you'd call me with an update, but I was hoping I could perhaps expedite the process. I'd be fascinated to hear more about what you're doing. The whole idea of signatures and resewing. It's a world I know nothing about, and I find myself curious. Alara's heart started beating a little faster. This was the moment. The pivot point. Was this a professional inquiry, or was it something more? I'd be happy to walk you through it, she said, keeping her voice even. I've fully disbound it now, and I'm starting the paper repairs. The original boards are in good shape, so I can definitely reuse them. That's fantastic news, he said, and his relief was palpable. You know, it's one thing to hear it over the phone, but I imagine it's another thing entirely to see it. Your workshop, it felt like a museum of a forgotten art. Some days it feels like that, she laughed. I was wondering, he began, and there was a slight, charming hesitation in his voice that she found endearing. If you're not too busy, would you be willing to let me buy you a cup of coffee sometime? You could tell me about the art of bookbinding, and I could tell you about the art of not letting a priceless family heirloom fall completely to pieces. There it was, an invitation. It was simple, direct, and cloaked in the comfortable guise of their shared project. It was perfect. The cautious, wounded part of her brain screamed warnings, flashing images of past disappointments. But another voice, a newer, quieter one that had been born in the silence of her prayer, whispered, say yes. I would like that very much, she said, and the words felt like a release. Are you free this weekend at all? Maybe Saturday afternoon. Saturday is perfect, she said, her mind already racing. What would she wear? What would they talk about? Great. There's a little place not too far from your shop, Hearth and Press. They have excellent coffee, and it's quiet enough to actually hear each other talk. Alara smiled. Of course he would choose Hearth and Press. It was her favorite cafe, a cozy place with mismatched chairs, the smell of roasting coffee, and shelves of secondhand books for sale. It was the antithesis of the aggressively modern concrete box where she'd endured her date with Mark. I know it well, she said. It's one of my favorites. A woman who restores books and loves a place called Hearth and Press. I should have guessed, he said warmly. How about 2 o'clock? 2 o'clock is perfect. I'll see you then, Julian. I'm looking forward to it, Alara. And thank you again for taking such care. It's my privilege, she said, and she meant it more than he could possibly know. After they hung up, Alara sank onto her stool, her hand pressed to her chest, as if to calm her racing heart. A slow, incredulous grin spread across her face. A date. She had a date. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she was filled not with a sense of weary obligation, but with a pure, unadulterated, terrifying excitement. That evening, she called her best friend, Chloe. Chloe was a pragmatic, sharp-witted landscape architect who had been Alara's steadfast companion through years of dating debacles. She was the one who had helped draft the infamous checklist and had been the first to suggest they burn it after the Mark fiasco. You're not going to believe this, Alara said, pacing her small living room. Let me guess. Chloe's voice crackled over the speakerphone. Mark the analyst circled back to give you a quarterly review of your date performance, complete with pie charts. Alara laughed, a genuine, bubbling sound. God, no. Nothing so horrific. I have a date. On Saturday. There was a beat of silence. Okay, Chloe said, her voice shifting into a more serious, protective tone. Source of date? App. Setup? That disastrous volleyball league you refuse to quit. None of the above. He's the client. A client. Chloe sounded intrigued. Alara, you've been running that shop for 6 years, and your most exciting client interaction to date involved an elderly man who wanted you to rebind his collection of 1970s appliance manuals. You need to give me more. So Alara told her everything. She described Julian walking into the shop, the gentle way he held the Bible, the reverence in his voice. She told her about his kind eyes and the laugh lines, about him being a luthier, about their easy, immediate connection. She described the phone call, the way he'd asked her out for coffee under the pretext of talking about the book. When she finished, Chloe was quiet for a moment. A luthier, she said finally, her voice soft with wonder. He mends violins. And cellos, Alara added. And you mend books. You're like a superhero duo for broken, beautiful things. The restorers. Alara blushed. Don't be ridiculous. I'm not being ridiculous. I'm being serious, Chloe said. Alara, this is different. This isn't some random guy you swiped right on because he had a picture with a golden retriever. This is a person who walked into your world, who speaks your language. He didn't just see a shop. He saw a sanctuary. He didn't just bring you a broken object. He brought you his family's history. I know, Alara whispered. That's what's so terrifying. Why is it terrifying? It's wonderful. Because it feels too perfect, Alara confessed, stopping her pacing to look at her reflection in the dark window. After I had that awful date with Mark, I came home and I prayed, Chloe. I really, truly prayed, in a way I haven't in years. I surrendered the whole mess. I asked God to send me someone kind, someone who understood the value of old things, a man of faith, the list goes on. And the very next business day, this man walks through my door carrying a Bible. It feels like a setup. Maybe it is, Chloe said gently. Maybe the universe, or God, or whatever you want to call it, finally got tired of watching you suffer through dates with finance bros and decided to deliver your order personally. But what if I'm wrong? Alara's voice was small. What if he's just a nice man who wants to know about bookbinding? And I'm turning it into this grand, cosmic sign. I don't think my heart can take another disappointment like that. Then you'll have had a nice cup of coffee with a kind-eyed luthier, and you'll have a great story about the one that got away, Chloe said, her pragmatism returning. But you won't know unless you go. Wear the green dress. And for heaven's sake, let yourself feel hopeful. It's been too long. Saturday arrived cloaked in the crisp, golden glory of a perfect autumn day. The air was cool enough. For a light sweater, and the sunlight fell in soft, buttery swathes across the city sidewalks. Alara spent the morning in a state of nervous energy, cleaning her already spotless apartment and changing her outfit 3 times before finally settling on Chloe's suggestion. A simple, forest green sweater dress that brought out the color of her eyes, paired with comfortable leather boots. She walked to Hearth and Press, arriving 5 minutes early, her hands cold despite the mild weather. The cafe was a haven of warmth and comforting aromas. The air hummed with the low murmur of conversation and the hiss of the espresso machine. She chose a small table in a quiet corner, one that offered a clear view of the door. She was just shrugging off her coat when the door opened, and Julian walked in. He saw her almost immediately, and the smile that broke across his face was so genuine and radiant that it melted a knot of anxiety in her stomach she hadn't even realized was there. He was wearing a dark blue flannel shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, and he looked even kinder in the warm light of the cafe than he had in her shop. "Alara," he said, his voice a low, pleasant rumble over the cafe's hum. "I'm glad you found the place." "It's hard to miss," she smiled, gesturing to the chair opposite her. "I'm magnetically drawn to any establishment with more books than customers." He laughed, a rich, easy sound. "I think we have that in common." He went to the counter to order, insisting on paying, and returned a few minutes later with 2 large, steaming mugs. He placed one in front of her. "I took a guess," he said. "Black coffee. You strike me as a purist." She was momentarily stunned. He was right. "How did you know?" He shrugged, a small, self-deprecating gesture. "The way you work. It's precise, uncluttered, focused on the essential nature of the thing itself. Seemed like a cream and sugar kind of person wouldn't have the patience for it." Alara stared at him. Mark had brought her a vanilla soy latte without asking, assuming it was what women drank. Julian had taken a moment to observe her, to think about who she might be, and had made an educated, insightful guess. It was a small thing, a ridiculously small thing, but it felt monumental. "You're a very observant luthier," she said, her voice a little breathless. "It's part of the job," he said, taking a sip of his own coffee. "You listen to a musician describe a problem with their instrument. They'll talk about the sound, the feel, but you have to look deeper. You have to see the tiny crack in the varnish, the slight warp in the bridge. You have to see what they can't. I suppose it's the same for you. You see the story behind the damage." "Exactly," she breathed, feeling that now familiar sense of profound kinship. "That's exactly it." The conversation flowed as easily as it had in her shop. He asked her about the Bible, and she found herself eagerly explaining the process she was undertaking, her hands moving as she described resewing the signatures onto new linen tapes, reinforcing the spine with Japanese paper and mull, and carefully recasing the book block into its original, restored cover. He listened with the focused intensity of a fellow craftsman, asking intelligent questions about the materials she used and the philosophy behind her choices. "So you're not trying to make it look brand new," he surmised. "You're stabilizing it. You're honoring its age. You want the repair to be sound, but you also want it to be honest," she explained, her passion for the subject making her forget her nervousness. "A book that's 150 years old should look like it's lived a life. The goal is to give it another 150 years, not to erase the first." "Stewardship," he said, the word landing in the space between them with a soft, significant weight. "That's what my father always called it. We don't really own things like that Bible, or the instruments I work on. We're just their caretakers for a time. Our job is to pass them on in better shape than we found them." Alara's breath caught in her throat. Stewardship, it was the perfect word. It encompassed everything she felt about her work, about history, about faith. She looked at him, at his earnest, kind face, the gentle intelligence in his dark eyes, and she felt a sense of recognition so powerful it almost made her dizzy. It was the feeling she had tried to describe in her prayer, the feeling of searching for a song she had never heard but would know instantly. This was it. This was the melody. I've never heard anyone put it that way before, she said softly. But that's it, isn't it? It's not about ownership. It's about stewardship. He smiled, a slow, knowing smile. I had a feeling you'd understand. He then turned the conversation to his own work, and she was captivated. He spoke of wood as if it were a living thing, with its own memory and temperament. He described the scent of spruce and maple in his workshop, the patient, meditative process of carving a scroll, the magical moment when he would string up a repaired violin and draw the bow across it for the first time, hearing its voice return from silence. There's nothing like it, he said, his eyes distant for a moment, lost in the memory. It's like helping something breathe again. They talked for over 2 hours. The coffee in their mugs grew cold. The afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the cafe floor. They moved from their work to books they loved, to places they'd traveled, to the shared feeling of being slightly out of step with a world that valued speed and novelty over patience and permanence. He spoke of his family, of the grandfather who had taught him woodworking, of the weight and privilege of being the current caretaker of the family Bible. He was open and unguarded, yet possessed a quiet strength that was deeply reassuring. There were no agendas, no checklists, no performative monologues. It was just a conversation. A real conversation between two people who were genuinely interested in discovering who the other was. With each passing minute, Alara felt the fragile, hopeful tendrils in her heart growing stronger, more confident, reaching for the sun. Finally, looking at the time, Julian gave a small, regretful sigh. I can't believe how long we've been talking. I should probably let you get on with your Saturday. I have nowhere else to be, she said, and the truth of the statement surprised her. Normally, a Saturday evening spent alone would be tinged with a faint melancholy. Tonight, the prospect felt peaceful, a time to savor and reflect. Well, I should, he said, though he made no move to leave. But I don't want to. The simple, honest admission sent a fresh wave of warmth through her. Me neither, she confessed. He finally stood, and she did as well. They walked out of the cafe into the cool, twilight air. The sky was a deep, bruised purple, and the streetlights were just beginning to flicker on. My workshop is just a few blocks from here, he said. Can I walk you back to your shop? Or home? My apartment is in the other direction, she said. But you could walk me to the corner. They walked in a comfortable silence for a block, the city sounds seeming to fade into a muted background hum. Alara was acutely aware of the space between them, of the warmth radiating from his arm, so close to hers. At the corner, beneath the amber glow of a street lamp, they stopped. Thank you, Alara, he said, turning to face her. This was the best conversation I've had in a very long time. Me too, she said, meeting his gaze. In his eyes, she saw no pretense, no artifice, just a reflection of the same quiet joy and wonder that was blooming in her own heart. I would really like to do this again, he said, his voice quiet but firm. If you would. I would, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I'd like that very much. He smiled, and for a moment, she thought he might reach for her hand. Instead, he just held her gaze for a second longer, a silent communication passing between them that was more eloquent than any words. Good night, Alara. Good night, Julian. She watched him walk away, his tall frame disappearing down the darkening street. She stood there for a long time, a dizzying, effervescent joy bubbling up inside her. Then she turned and began the walk home, a smile on her face that she couldn't have wiped away if she tried. The world seemed to have been recalibrated. The colors of the city were richer, the air was cleaner, the faces of the strangers she passed seemed kinder. She was walking the same streets she walked every day, but she was seeing them through new eyes. She was a restorer who was, herself, being restored. When she reached her apartment, she unlocked the door and stepped inside. The silence that greeted her was the same silence that had felt so oppressive and hollow just a week ago. But tonight, it was different. It was a peaceful, welcoming silence. It was no longer the sound of absence. It was the sound of a held breath, of a story waiting for its next, beautiful chapter to begin. Her eyes fell on the small, kneeling prayer bench in the corner of her bedroom. She walked over to it and gently ran her hand over the dark, smooth wood. She didn't kneel. She didn't need to. Her heart was already overflowing with a prayer of its own, a simple, silent, two-word prayer of profound and overwhelming gratitude. Thank you. Chapter 3. The Resonance of Wood. The morning after her coffee with Julian, Alara awoke to a world washed in a new, more luminous shade of light. The sunlight that filtered through the leaves of the great oak outside her bedroom window seemed less an intrusion and more a gentle invitation. It painted the opposite wall in shifting patterns of gold, and for the first time in years, she didn't see the dust motes dancing in its beams. She saw only the light itself, pure and unconditional. She made tea, and the familiar ritual felt sacred. The steam rising from the ceramic mug, the warmth seeping into her palms, the bitter, earthy scent of the Earl Grey. It was all imbued with a quiet significance that had been absent before. The silence of her small apartment, once a companion she had merely tolerated, now felt like a soft blanket, a space in which to hold and examine the delicate, incandescent thing that had taken root in her heart. Hope. It was a terrifying and exhilarating sensation. Hope, she had learned, was a high-stakes investment. It demanded vulnerability. It exposed one to the devastating potential of loss. For so long, she had kept her emotional accounts balanced, making only safe, low-yield investments in her work, in her friendship with Chloe, in the predictable comforts of her routine. What she felt now was the emotional equivalent of betting everything on a single, improbable turn of a card. She had replayed their conversation a dozen times, searching for flaws in the memory, for the subtle red flags her optimism might have overlooked. She found none. There had been no posturing, no carefully curated anecdotes designed to impress, no hint of the conversational narcissism that had defined so many of her previous dates. There had been only a genuine, unhurried exchange between two people who spoke the same quiet language, the language of patience, of reverence for the past, of finding beauty in the act of mending what was broken. He saw the world not as a thing to be conquered or consumed, but as a treasure to be cared for. Stewardship, the word echoed in her mind, a perfect, resonant chord. On Sunday, the Gilded Page was closed to the public, but it was often when Alara did her most focused work. Today, she felt drawn to the shop not by obligation, but by a joyful, magnetic pull. She wanted to pour the strange, wonderful energy humming through her veins into her work, specifically into the Anderson Bible. She unlocked the front door and stepped into the familiar, book-scented air. The space felt different today, too. Less a fortress against the world and more a stage for quiet miracles. The Anderson Bible lay on her workbench, its disassembled signatures neatly stacked, its weary covers resting nearby. It was a patient on her operating table, waiting for her to perform the delicate surgery that would make it whole again. The next stage was one of her favorites, the sewing. It was the heart of the book's structure, the very thing that bound disparate pages into a unified whole. She set up her sewing frame, a simple, elegant wooden contraption that had been used by bookbinders for centuries. She stretched 4 linen tapes taut between the frame's crossbar and its base, their pale threads forming a ladder upon which the book would be rebuilt. This was the Bible's new skeleton, its new spine. The old one had been made of brittle glue and decaying thread, but this one would be strong, flexible, and archival, designed to last another century or more. She picked up the first signature, the genealogy, the pages that held Julian's name. With a long, slender needle and a length of linen thread, she began. The work was slow and meditative. She passed the needle through the center of the folded pages, out and around the first tape, back in, out and around the second, a steady, rhythmic motion that fell into sync with her breathing. Each stitch was a small act of faith, a promise of cohesion. As her hands moved with practiced grace, her mind drifted back to Julian. She thought of his hands, which she now knew were accustomed to a similar kind of patient, detailed work. She pictured them carving the delicate scroll of a violin, planing a sliver of maple to the thickness of a few sheets of paper, feeling for the subtle vibrations that signaled an instrument's health. He bound things with tension and harmony. She bound them with thread and paste. They were both restorers of voice, he for instruments, she for stories. The thought made her smile as she pulled a stitch tight. She was literally weaving a new future for his family's history. With each pass of the needle, she felt as if she were adding her own small, invisible stitch to the tapestry of their lives, reinforcing not just the paper and ink, but the very idea of continuity, of a legacy being carefully tended and passed on. The work filled her with a profound sense of purpose that transcended the mere mechanics of her craft. She wasn't just fixing a book. She was participating in an act of love. By late afternoon, the sun was slanting low through the front window, and she had sewn the final signature into place. The book block was now a single, solid unit, resting securely on its new linen tapes. She ran her hand over the freshly sewn spine. It was strong, flexible, and even. It felt alive beneath her fingers. She had taken a scattering of fragile leaves and made them a family again. The satisfaction was deep and pure. As she was cleaning her tools, her phone buzzed on the workbench. Her breath caught. She saw a number she didn't recognize, but somehow knew. Her hands, dusted with paper filings, trembled slightly as she swiped to answer. It was a text message. Good morning, Alara. I hope you're having a good weekend. I'm still thinking about our conversation yesterday. Her heart did a slow, dizzying flip. It was so simple, so direct. No games, no waiting periods, no ambiguity. She typed a reply, her fingers feeling clumsy. I had a wonderful time, Julian. I'm at the shop today, actually. I just finished sewing the new spine for your Bible. His reply came back almost instantly. You work on Sundays? I knew we were kindred spirits. Is that something a curious luthier might be allowed to see? The question was playful, but the implication was clear. He wanted to see her again. Soon. A curious luthier would be most welcome, she typed, a grin spreading across her face. But my sanctuary is closed for the day. Perhaps you'd be willing to show me yours sometime instead? She held her breath after sending it. It was a bold move, turning his invitation around, expressing her own curiosity. It felt risky, a step out onto the wire. The 3 small dots indicating he was typing seemed to flash for an eternity. I would like that more than I can say. My workshop is my favorite place in the world, and I can think of nothing better than sharing it with you. Are you free next Saturday? They made a plan. He would pick her up in the early afternoon. He told her his workshop was in an old warehouse district by the river, a part of the city that had resisted gentrification, where artisans and craftspeople still worked in sprawling, high-ceilinged spaces. The prospect of it, of seeing him in his element, sent a thrill of anticipation through her that was so potent it was almost unnerving. The week passed in a haze of focused work and quiet daydreams. She spoke to Chloe on Tuesday night, recounting every detail of the coffee date and the subsequent text exchange. His workshop, Chloe had shrieked with delight. Oh, this is next-level romantic. This is the luthier equivalent of inviting you back to his place, but classier. You're going to see his tools, Alara. You're going to smell his sawdust. Chloe, calm down. Alara had laughed, though her own excitement was bubbling just as fiercely. It's just a visit. No, it's not just a visit, Chloe had insisted, her voice growing serious. It's an invitation into his soul. You showed him your sanctuary. Now he's showing you his. This is big. Don't you dare wear sensible shoes. Wear the boots. The good ones. Alara had rolled her eyes, but she knew Chloe was right. It did feel big. It felt significant. And as Saturday approached, her nervousness grew in direct proportion to her excitement. What if his workshop was a mess? What if she said the wrong thing? What if the easy magic of their first meeting had been a fluke, a perfect alignment of caffeine and atmosphere that couldn't be recreated? The old, cautious part of her brain was working overtime, trying to protect her by whispering warnings of impending disappointment. But this time, the new voice was stronger. The one that had been awakened by his kindness, by their shared understanding. It whispered back, what if it's even better? On Saturday, when Julian's car, an older but meticulously maintained dark green Volvo, pulled up in front of her apartment building, Alara felt a flutter in her stomach so intense it almost took her breath away. She had followed Chloe's advice and was wearing her favorite leather boots, along with dark jeans and a soft, cream-colored cashmere sweater. She wanted to look effortlessly comfortable, a goal that had required a significant amount of effort. He got out of the car as she approached, and his smile was just as warm and genuine as she remembered. It was a smile that reached all the way to his dark, intelligent eyes. "You look wonderful," he said, his voice a low, pleasant sound against the city's hum. He opened the passenger door for her, a small, courteous gesture that felt both old-fashioned and deeply welcome. The drive to the warehouse district was filled with easy conversation. He asked about the progress on the Bible, and she told him about lining the newly sewn spine with Japanese paper and mull, a woven, starched fabric that adds strength. He listened intently, nodding in understanding. "It's like reinforcing a joint," he said. "We use something similar, strips of linen, sometimes, to repair cracks in the body of a cello. Different materials, same principle." This constant discovery of shared principles, of a common philosophy underlying their different crafts, was a source of endless delight for Alara. It felt like they were discovering a secret, shared homeland. He turned off the main road onto a wide, cobblestone street lined with sprawling brick buildings. Their tall, multi-paned windows were dark with age, and faded lettering from a bygone industrial era ghosted across their facades. Merchants Textile Co., Standard Ironworks. He pulled up in front of a particularly large, anonymous-looking building and cut the engine. "Here we are," he said, a note of quiet pride in his voice. Inside, the building was a labyrinth of echoing hallways and giant freight elevators. Julian led her up a flight of wide, worn concrete stairs to the third floor. He stopped in front of a heavy, unmarked steel door and unlocked it. "Brace yourself," he said with a small smile. "It's a bit chaotic, but it's an organized chaos." He pushed the door open, and Alara stepped inside. The first thing that hit her was the smell. It was a scent so complex and wonderful she wanted to bottle it. The sharp, resinous perfume of raw wood, the sweet, almond-like aroma of varnish, the faint, clea, in bite of turpentine, and underneath it all, the dry, earthy scent of sawdust. It was the smell of creation. The space itself was enormous, a vast, open room with ceilings that soared 20 feet high. Light poured in from a wall of massive, industrial windows, illuminating the air, which was thick with the same golden, dancing dust she had in her own shop. But this wasn't paper dust. It was the dust of maple and spruce, the powdered ghosts of future music. The workshop was, as he'd said, a kind of organized chaos. Along one wall, racks of pale, unfinished wood were stacked, sorted by size and type, aging patiently. From the ceiling, the disembodied bodies of violins, violas, and cellos hung like strange, beautiful sculptures, their curves gleaming in the light. Several workbenches, scarred and stained with a century of use, were arranged throughout the space. Each was a tableau of its own. One held a violin clamped in a vise, its top carefully removed to reveal the intricate architecture within. Another was covered in a dizzying array of tiny, specialized tools, knives, gouges, finger planes so small they looked like they belonged in a doll's house. Alara stood in the doorway, utterly captivated. It was more than a workshop. It was a cathedral dedicated to wood and sound. It was his sanctuary. "Julian," she breathed, her voice filled with awe. "It's incredible." He beamed, his pride evident and endearing. "I'm glad you think so. To most people, it probably just looks like a mess." "No," she said, stepping further into the room and running a hand over a plank of wood that was as smooth as silk. "It looks like a place where magic happens." He took her on a tour, his voice filled with a quiet passion that was mesmerizing. He showed her the difference between the tight grain of spruce, used for the resonant tops of instruments, and the spectacular, flame-like figuring of the maple used for their backs and sides. He let her hold a block of ebony, astonishingly heavy and dense, destined to become a fingerboard. He explained the alchemical process of making his own varnish from exotic resins and oils, a recipe passed down from his grandfather. "He always said the varnish was the instrument's soul," Julian explained, holding a small jar of amber-colored liquid up to the light. "It has to be tough enough to protect the wood, but flexible enough to let it breathe, to let it sing." Alara listened, completely absorbed. She was seeing the man and his work as a single, indivisible entity. His gentleness, his patience, his deep respect for his materials. It was all there, in the careful organization of his tools, in the reverent way he handled a half-finished cello, in the very air of the room. He led her to the oldest workbench, which stood in the best light by the window. It was made of thick, heavy oak, its surface a geography of history, covered in nicks, cuts, and dark, circular stains. "This one was my grandfather's," he said, running his hand over the worn wood, a gesture she recognized from the way he had touched his family's Bible. "He started the business here after the war. My father worked at this bench, too, and I learned everything I know standing right here." He looked at her, and his eyes were unguarded, revealing a layer of vulnerability she hadn't seen before. Sometimes the weight of it feels heavy. This legacy, this history, the expectation to be as good as they were. "But you are," Alara said softly, with a certainty that surprised her. "You are Julian. I can see it. It's in every corner of this room. It's in the way you talk about your work. It's not just a job to you. It's a calling. It's stewardship." He looked at her, and the smile he gave her was different from his others. It was slower, quieter, and filled with a profound sense of gratitude. "Thank you for that," he said, his voice husky. "You have a way of finding the right word for everything." The space between them seemed to shrink, the vast workshop suddenly feeling as intimate as a small room. The air was charged with an unspoken understanding, with the resonance of two solitary people recognizing a kindred spirit. He gestured to a cello resting in a stand nearby, its varnish glowing like dark honey. "This is the one I just finished," he said, his voice regaining its professional calm, though a new warmth lingered beneath it. "A repair?" The neck was broken. He picked up a bow, tightened the horsehair, and drew it across the strings. He didn't play a song, just a simple, rising scale. The sound that bloomed in the cavernous room was astonishing. It was a voice, deep, rich, and achingly beautiful, vibrating not just in the air, but in the floorboards, in Alara's own chest. It was the sound of something broken made whole again, its voice not just restored, but perhaps even richer for the mending. The last note faded into the sunlit, dusty air, leaving a perfect silence in its wake. Julian lowered the bow, his eyes still on the instrument, a look of deep satisfaction on his face. "It breathes again," Alara whispered. He looked up and met her gaze. He was standing only a few feet away from her now. The sounds of the city outside seemed to have disappeared entirely. There was only the scent of wood and varnish, the sight of the golden light filtering through the window, and the lingering vibration of that perfect, resonant note. "Alara," he said, and her name on his lips was a sound as beautiful as the cellos. He took a step closer, and then another. He didn't reach for her, but his presence was a question. She could have stepped back, could have broken the spell, but she didn't move. She couldn't. She felt rooted to the spot, held there by a force as strong and invisible as gravity. He slowly raised his hand, not to touch her face, but to gently brush a stray piece of sawdust from her sweater. His fingers barely grazed the cashmere, but a jolt of electricity shot through her. His eyes searched hers, asking for permission. She gave it with a small, almost imperceptible nod. He closed the remaining distance between them and lowered his head. The first touch was impossibly gentle, a soft, hesitant press of his lips against hers. It was not a kiss of hungry passion, but of quiet discovery, of profound recognition. It tasted of hope and smelled of sawdust and varnish. It was a confirmation of everything she had felt, of every silent conversation that had passed between them. It was the feeling of coming home to a place you'd never been before. She leaned into him, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, and the kiss deepened, becoming more confident, more sure. It was a mending of its own, a joining of two lives that had been quietly, patiently waiting for this very moment. A silent promise was being made, not in words, but in this slow, tender language that they both, somehow, already knew by heart. When they finally broke apart, they rested their foreheads together, their th mingling in the quiet air. Alara kept her eyes closed, savoring the moment, engraving it into her memory. "I had a feeling," Julian murmured, his voice a low rumble against her hands. "A feeling about what?" she whispered back, opening her eyes to find his looking at her with an expression of pure, unadulterated wonder. "That you would feel," he paused, searching for the word, "like this. Like you belong here." And in his sanctuary, surrounded by the beautiful, broken things he had dedicated his life to healing, Alara felt the last of her own broken pieces click quietly, perfectly, into place. She was home. Chapter 4. The Patina of Trust. The world did not rush back in. After Julian's lips left hers, the silence in the workshop held them suspended, wrapped in the scent of wood shavings and the ghost of a cello's note. The motes of dust, which had danced so feverishly in the afternoon sun, seemed to be settling, as if in deference to the quiet gravity that had just asserted itself between them. Alara kept her forehead pressed to his, her eyes closed, trying to memorize the texture of this moment. The solid feel of his chest beneath her palms, the warmth of his breath against her skin, the faint, clean smell of rosin that clung to his shirt. "Like you belong here," he had said, and the words were not a compliment but a statement of fact. A key turning in a lock she hadn't known was sealed. For most of her life, she had felt like a guest in other people's stories, a careful observer standing just outside the circle of warmth. To be told she belonged, in this place that was so intrinsically him, was to be given a sense of placement in the world that she had never, ever felt before. She opened her eyes. His were still on her, dark and deep, and the wonder she saw in them was a mirror of her own. He hadn't pulled away. He seemed as reluctant as she was to break the spell. His hands, which had been resting lightly on her waist, tightened their grip almost imperceptibly, a silent affirmation. She started, but her voice was a fragile thing. What could she possibly say? "Thank you" felt impossibly small. "I feel it too" felt like a breathtakingly risky admission. He saved her from having to choose. A slow smile touched his lips, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "I think," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble, "that this might complicate the professional nature of our relationship." The gentle humor was a gift, a bridge back to the shared ground of conversation. Alara felt a laugh bubble up, light and relieved. "You think? I was worried you were going to start charging me for the tour." "The tour is free." he murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips for a fraction of a second before returning to her eyes. The emotional fallout, however, might come at a premium. She leaned back slightly, finally creating a few inches of space between them, though his hands remained on her waist, a warm and grounding presence. She looked around the vast, sun-drenched room, seeing it differently now. It was no longer just his sanctuary. It felt like a shared secret. "What were you working on before I so rudely interrupted your Saturday?" she asked, gesturing toward the workbench. He followed her gaze, his expression softening as it fell upon his work. It was a look of deep, abiding affection, the same look he had given the Anderson Bible. "A patient," he said, releasing her and moving toward the bench. An old German violin, early 19th century. It came in with a soundpost crack. A tiny fracture, but it can be fatal to the instrument's voice. He picked up a tool from the bench, a long, slender steel rod with a hook at the end. "The soundpost is this little dowel of spruce," he explained, pointing into the F-hole of another violin body. "It's not glued in. It's held in place by pure tension between the top and the back. They call it l'âme du violin in French. The soul of the violin. It transmits the vibrations. It supports the structure. It's the heart." Alara moved to stand beside him, captivated. "So when it cracks, the heart is broken," he finished simply. "The voice becomes thin, reedy. The soul goes quiet. The repair is delicate. You have to reinforce the crack from the inside with tiny spruce studs, working through the F-holes with tools like this. It's like performing keyhole surgery on a butterfly." She watched his hands as he described the process, the long, capable fingers miming the intricate work inside the invisible violin. She thought of her own work, of mending a tear in a page with Japanese tissues so fine it was nearly transparent, of reinforcing a crumbling spine. Keyhole surgery on a butterfly. He had found the words for her craft as well as his. "My grandfather used to say that every instrument that comes through that door is a test," Julian said, his voice quieter now, filled with reminiscence. He ran his hand over the scarred oak of the workbench, the same gesture she'd seen before, a touching of a sacred object. "Not just a test of skill, but a test of character. Can you be patient enough? Can you listen to what the wood is telling you? Can you set your own ego aside and just serve the music that's trapped inside?" He looked at her then, and she saw the weight of his legacy again, but this time it looked less like a burden and more like a mantle, one he wore with a deep, if sometimes heavy, sense of honor. "He sounds like he was an extraordinary man," Alara said softly. "He was," Julian confirmed with a nod. "And stubborn. And he smelled permanently of shellac. He taught me how to read the grain of a piece of wood like it was a story. This tree saw a drought, he'd say. This one grew on a windy hill." He believed everything had a history, and that if you ignored that history, you could never truly fix the object. You'd just be patching it up. The resonance with her own philosophy was so profound it was almost startling. It was the core of her belief, the gospel she preached to the few clients who understood. Don't erase the water stain, stabilize it. Don't replace the worn leather, feed it. Honor the life the object has lived. She had spent years feeling like a lone practitioner of a forgotten faith, and here, standing next to this man who smelled of sawdust and varnish, she had found its other parishioner. The sun was sinking lower, casting long, dramatic shadows across the workshop floor. The golden hour light turned the hanging cello bodies into burnished deities. The magic of the afternoon was beginning to wane, giving way to the gentle melancholy of a day's end. "I should probably let you get back to your work," she said, though she had no desire to leave. She felt she could stand in this room with him for 100 years. "My work can wait," he said immediately. "But I should get you home. It's getting late." The drive back was filled with a different kind of silence than the one on the way there. It was no longer the quiet of two strangers feeling each other out, but the comfortable, humming silence of two people who had just shared something significant. The space inside the old Volvo felt charged and intimate. When he pulled up to her building, he cut the engine. He turned to her, his face half lit by the orange glow of a streetlight. "I know this is forward," he began, his voice hesitant for the first time all day, "and I don't want to rush anything. But I would very much like to see you again. Outside of our respective workshops. Perhaps for dinner?" The relief that washed over Alara was so potent it made her feel lightheaded. The fear, lurking in the back of her mind, that the kiss had been a fluke, a product of the workshop's enchanted atmosphere, dissolved completely. "I would like that more than I can say," she replied, her own voice steady and clear. They made a plan for the following Thursday, a quiet Italian place he knew in a nearby neighborhood. As she got out of the car, he walked with her to the front door of her building. The gesture was simple, protective, and it made her heart ache with a sweet, unfamiliar tenderness. Under the dim light of the entryway, he stopped. He didn't move to kiss her again, and she was grateful for his restraint. Another kiss would have felt like trying to replicate the first, to force the magic. Instead, he just looked at her, his expression warm and open. "Thank you for today, Alara," he said. "For seeing it. And me. Thank you for showing me," she replied. He reached out, and, instead of touching her, he gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. The brief touch of his fingers against her temple sent another jolt through her, as potent as the kiss itself. "Thursday, then." "Thursday," she confirmed with a smile. She watched him walk back to his car before she turned and went inside, her keys trembling slightly in her hand. Once inside her apartment, she leaned against the closed door, her eyes shut, and let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for a decade. The silence here was different from the silence in his workshop. His was filled with the patient presence of wood and history. Hers was simply empty. But tonight, it wasn't an oppressive emptiness. It was filled with the echo of his voice, the memory of his touch, the lingering scent of spruce and varnish that she imagined, for a moment, still clung to her sweater. She walked through her small living room, touching the spines of her own books, the worn fabric of her favorite armchair. The space felt both deeply familiar and fundamentally changed. It was her sanctuary, her fortress against a world that had too often proven harsh and disappointing. But for the first time, the walls felt less like protection and more like confinement. She had been invited into another person's sacred space, and it had somehow expanded her own. She made herself a cup of chamomile tea, her hands moving through the familiar motions on autopilot. Her mind was a whirlwind. She replayed every moment, every word, every glance. The rational, cautious part of her brain, the part that had kept her safe for so long, was trying to find the flaw, the catch. It was too easy, too perfect. People didn't just meet and connect like this, speaking a language no one else understood. It was the stuff of novels, not the messy reality of life. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach. The higher you let yourself fly, the farther you have to fall. But then she would remember the look in his eyes when he talked about his grandfather, or the reverent way his hands had cradled the old violin, or the impossible gentleness of his kiss, and the hope would rise up again, fierce and incandescent, melting the knot of fear. She picked up her phone and dialed Chloe. "Spill," Chloe said, answering on the second ring without even a hello. Every single sawdust-scented detail. "I've been staring at my phone for 4 hours. Alara laughed, sinking onto her sofa. Chloe, it was good," Chloe prompted, her voice practically vibrating with anticipation. "It was more than good," Alara said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "It was resonant." "Oh, you and your bookbinder words," Chloe scoffed affectionately. "Did he kiss you?" Alara smiled into the phone. "He did." A shriek erupted from the other end of the line, so loud Alara had to pull the receiver away from her ear. "Yes, I knew it." "Was it workshop Y and romantic? Did he move a cello out of the way to sweep you into his arms? Was there varnish involved?" It was quiet, Alara said, trying to describe the indescribable. And gentle. It felt inevitable, like a conversation we were already having. Oh, you are so far gone, Chloe said, her voice softening with genuine happiness for her friend. I've never heard you talk like this. Ever. So what's next? Are you seeing him tomorrow? Thursday. For dinner. Thursday? That's 5 days away, Chloe exclaimed. Classic man move. Keeping you waiting, building the tension. No, Alara said quickly, a protective instinct flaring up. It's not like that. It's not a game. It just feels right. This pace. It feels considered. Okay. I'm sorry, Chloe said, sensing her friend's defensiveness. You're right. You two aren't exactly the Tinder swiping type. Considered. I like that. It's very you. Just be careful, Alara. Don't build him up into some mythical creature. He's just a man. I know, Alara said, though in her heart, she wasn't so sure. He didn't feel like just a man. He felt like a destination. The days leading up to Thursday were a strange mix of heightened awareness and deep focus. Every mundane task was imbued with a new sheen of significance. The tea she brewed in the morning tasted richer, the sunlight seemed warmer, the books in her shop felt like old friends sharing in her secret joy. She and Julian exchanged a few texts, but they were spare and perfect, their own unique form of communication. He sent her a close-up photo of a magnificently figured piece of maple, its iridescent stripes shimmering like a tiger's eye. Quilted maple for a cello back, the message read. Thought you'd appreciate the topography. She sent him a picture of the marbled end papers she'd chosen for his Bible, a swirling pattern of deep blues and golds that looked like a map of the cosmos. The universe in which your family's story will live, she wrote. There were no logistical questions, no how was your day platitudes. Their texts were like their conversation, rooted in their shared reverence for beauty and craft. Each message was a small, polished stone dropped into the quiet pool of her week, sending out concentric rings of happy anticipation. She threw herself into her work on the Anderson Bible with a renewed sense of purpose. It was no longer just a fascinating project or a link to a handsome client. It was a tangible piece of him, of his history, sitting on her workbench. When she handled the worn, supple leather of the original covers, she felt a connection to the generations of his family who had held it. The book was a vessel of his legacy, and she was its steward. The original boards were warped, and the leather was dry and brittle at the joints. Her task was not to replace it, but to consolidate it. She spent hours carefully lifting the old leather from the boards, painstakingly scraping away the dried, crumbling paste from its underside. Then, with a special conservation adhesive, she re-adhered it to new, flat boards, meticulously working out any air bubbles. The most delicate part was treating the leather itself. She mixed up a special dressing of lanolin and other oils, and with a soft cloth, she began to massage it into the thirsty, tired leather. The work was slow, repetitive, and deeply satisfying. As her fingers worked the life-giving oils into the surface, the leather began to change. The faded black deepened, the scuffs and scratches didn't disappear, but they became part of a richer story. The leather developed a soft, warm sheen. It was a patina, the visible record of a long and well-loved life. She wasn't erasing its history. She was making it strong enough to continue it. This, she thought, as she worked under the focused beam of her task light, is what trust feels like. It isn't a shiny, new, perfect thing. It's a patina that develops over time, through gentle handling, patient attention, and a commitment to preserving what is true. It's the gradual deepening of color, the softening of rigid exteriors, the acceptance of imperfections not as flaws, but as marks of character. What she was feeling for Julian wasn't a sudden, blinding infatuation. It was the slow, steady development of this beautiful, strengthening patina. On Thursday night, She was so nervous, she changed her outfit 3 times before settling on a simple black dress made of a soft, heavy silk that felt both elegant and comfortable. When she met Julian outside the restaurant, a small, unassuming place with a single red geranium in its window box, he was wearing a dark gray blazer over a simple white shirt. He looked devastatingly handsome, and the smile he gave her melted away the last of her anxiety. "You look beautiful, Alara," he said, his eyes drinking her in. The restaurant was perfect. It was quiet, filled with the low murmur of conversation and the clink of silverware. The air smelled of garlic and old wine. They were seated at a small corner table, and for a moment, Alara felt a flicker of panic. In their workshops, they were surrounded by the things they understood, the physical language of their crafts. Here, in the neutral territory of the everyday world, with nothing but a white tablecloth between them, would they run out of things to say? She needn't have worried. The conversation flowed as easily as the wine their waiter poured. They talked about their work, of course, but they also ventured into new territory. He told her about growing up in the city, spending his summers covered in sawdust in his father's workshop. She found herself talking about her childhood in a small university town, about her love for the campus library, how she felt more at home in the hushed silence of the history stacks than she ever did at the playground. She was careful, skirting the edges of the real reason her childhood had been so solitary, the defining tragedy that had shaped her. It was too soon to offer up that shattered piece of her history, but she found she could share other things, smaller vulnerabilities. "I was always a strange child," she admitted with a small smile. "My favorite toy was a box of my grandmother's old letters. I'd spend hours just holding them, smelling the paper, trying to decipher the faded cursive. I think I fell in love with the idea that an object could hold a person's entire life inside it." He didn't laugh or find it quaint. He nodded, his expression serious and understanding. "My grandfather's tools," he said. "I have them all. Most of them aren't as efficient as modern ones, but I still use them sometimes. When I hold one of his carving gouges, the wooden handle worn smooth and dark in the exact places his hand would have rested, it's like a conversation across time. I feel him there with me. I understand." And he did. He truly did. To be understood on that level, about the strange, quiet passions that had defined her life, was a more profound intimacy than she had ever known. Over dessert, a shared tiramisu they ate with 2 spoons, he paused and looked at her, a thoughtful expression on his face. "There's a tiny smudge of blue ink," he said, his voice soft, "just at the corner of your right eye. It's been there all evening." Alara's hand flew to her face, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "Oh my God. I was recasing a book with a blue cloth this afternoon. I must have." "Don't," he said, reaching across the table and gently catching her hand. His thumb stroked the back of her knuckles. "I wasn't telling you so you would wipe it away. I was telling you because I like it. It's like you carry a little piece of your world with you wherever you go." She looked at him, her heart doing a slow, powerful turn in her chest. He wasn't just accepting her carefully presented self. He was seeing and appreciating the messy, ink-stained truth of her. He saw the smudge not as an imperfection, but as a part of her story. He kept hold of her hand as they walked out of the restaurant and into the cool night air. His hand was warm and strong around hers, his calloused palm a comforting, solid presence. It felt less like a romantic gesture and more like a simple, physical statement of fact. "We are here, together." They walked in comfortable silence for several blocks, the city lights painting patterns on the pavement. When they reached her corner, he stopped. He turned to her, his other hand coming up to cup her cheek, his thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw. "Every moment I spend with you," he said, his voice low and earnest, "feels more real than the last." He leaned in and kissed her. This kiss was different from the first. The element of surprise was gone, replaced by a quiet certainty. It was deeper, more confident, a kiss that spoke not of discovery, but of confirmation. It tasted of coffee and wine and the sweet promise of a future she was finally, daringly, beginning to let herself believe in. When he drew back, he rested his forehead against hers, just as he had in the workshop. "Good night, Alara." "Good night, Julian." She didn't invite him in, and he didn't ask. There was an unspoken agreement between them to honor the deliberate, unhurried pace they had established. Theirs was a story that deserved a slow, careful binding. Back in her apartment, the silence that greeted her was no longer empty or echoing. It was peaceful. It was a space to hold the warmth of the evening. Shiwi, and tea to her workbench, where the Anderson Bible lay resting under a weight. She gently uncovered it and ran her hand over the newly treated leather cover. It felt supple, strong, and alive beneath her fingers. The patina of its long history was intact, not erased, but enriched. It was ready for the next chapter. And, she realized with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, so was she. Chapter 5. The Architecture of Intimacy. The days that followed were like the slow, deliberate process of setting a book in a press. There was a gentle, constant pressure, a sense of disparate elements being brought into alignment, of a new and permanent shape being formed. The world outside Alara's workshop continued its frantic pace, but her own internal rhythm had changed. It had slowed to match the steady, considered beat of her burgeoning relationship with Julian. The quiet hum in her apartment was no longer the sound of solitude, but the resonant frequency of anticipation. She spent her days working on the Anderson Bible with a devotion that bordered on worship. The project had become a sacrament. Each meticulous stage of the restoration felt like a parallel act in the construction of her own new reality. She spent 2 full days sewing the signatures, the folded groups of pages, back onto new linen cords. Her needle, a long, thin surgeon's tool, flashed in and out of the paper, her movements precise and economical. With each stitch, she felt as though she were mending something within herself, pulling together the scattered pages of her own life into a coherent whole. The rhythm was hypnotic. Pierce the paper, draw the thread taut, form the knot, move to the next station. It was a meditation on connection, on the humble, invisible work that creates enduring strength. When Julian sent her a photo of a cello scroll, half-carved, the maple wood curling away from the gouge in perfect, fragrant spirals, she replied with a picture of her own hands, covered in a fine white dust of paper shavings and dried paste. Building the foundation, she wrote. He responded almost instantly. Asterisk the most important part. Everything rests on it. Asterisk. Their communication continued in this vein, a language of craft and metaphor that felt more intimate than any conventional flirtation. They were not just learning about each other's days. They were learning how the other saw the world. They were architects comparing blueprints, discovering with quiet astonishment that they were designing the same structure. The following Saturday, he came to her world. The bell above her shop door chimed, a familiar, cheerful sound. But when she looked up from the book she was paring leather for, the sight of him standing there, framed by her own collection of old books and printing tools, sent a jolt of such potent rightness through her that she momentarily forgot how to breathe. He was wearing a simple dark sweater, and he held a brown paper bag that smelled divinely of coffee and cardamom buns. "I was in the neighborhood," he said, though they both knew his workshop was a 30-minute drive away. "I thought your workshop deserved a proper visit. And I come bearing bribes." She smiled, wiping her hands on her canvas apron. "The bribes are entirely unnecessary, but deeply appreciated." He placed the bag on a clear corner of her counter and looked around, his gaze slow and deeply appreciative. He didn't just scan the room, he read it. He saw the row of antique book presses lined up against one wall like ancient sentinels. He saw the myriad of small, specific tools arranged neatly on a pegboard, bone folders polished smooth by years of use. all with handles of worn rosewood, gleaming paring knives. His eyes lingered on a folio-sized volume of botanical prints lying open on a viewing stand, its hand-colored plates glowing under the light. "This is incredible, Alara," he said, his voice soft with a familiar reverence. "It's quieter than my space. More precise. It smells like old paper and beeswax. And yours smells like a forest floor after the rain," she countered gently. He walked over to her main workbench, where the newly sewn text block of his family's Bible sat waiting. He didn't touch it. He simply looked at the neat, even stitching along the spine, the 5 strong linen cords that now formed its new backbone. "You do beautiful work," he said, looking from the book to her. "It's so strong, so honest." She felt a flush of pleasure that was far more profound than if he had complimented her appearance. He saw the integrity in her work. He understood the soul of it. She explained the process to him, how she had reinforced the first and last signatures with Japanese paper, how the new spine lining would provide flexible support. He listened with the focused intensity of a fellow craftsman, asking questions about the properties of different adhesives, the tension of the sewing thread. He picked up a sheet of marbled paper she had set aside for the end papers, the one with the pattern of blue and gold nebulae. "The universe," he murmured, tracing the swirling lines with his finger. "It's perfect." She made them coffee, and they sat on 2 tall stools, eating the warm, sticky cardamom buns he'd brought. The conversation was easy, weaving between the technical and the personal. He told her about a particularly stubborn cello he was restoring, one that had been in a fire and whose varnish was a puzzle of char and chemical change. She told him about a collection of 19th-century children's books she was repairing for the city library, how their torn pages and broken bindings told a story of being loved almost to death. "Sometimes," she confessed, looking at the worn cover of a copy of The Secret Garden, "I think the damage is just as important as the original object. It's a record of a relationship. You can't just erase that. You honor the scars," he said, nodding. "You make them strong, so they can be part of the story instead of the end of it." She looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup, her heart full. He gets it. He truly, truly gets it. It was a feeling of being seen so completely that it was almost unnerving, like standing in a bright, clean light with nothing to hide behind. Their time together began to form a rhythm, a quiet pattern woven into the fabric of their weeks. They didn't do what Alara thought of as traditional dating. There were no loud bars or crowded cinemas. Instead, they explored the city's quiet, forgotten corners. One rainy Sunday, they spent hours in the city's Natural History Museum, not looking at the dinosaur bones, but in a dusty, overlooked gallery dedicated to antique scientific instruments, gleaming brass astrolabes, intricate auroras, and microscopes that looked like works of art. They spoke in hushed tones about the minds and hands that had made them, about the shared human impulse to create tools to understand the universe. Another evening, they attend a concert in a small church known for its perfect acoustics. It was a Baroque ensemble playing on period instruments. Alara watched Julian as he listened, his eyes closed, his head tilted slightly. He wasn't just hearing the music, he was communing with it. She could see his hands making infinitesimal movements, feeling the phantom weight of a bow, his mind tracing the vibrations as they left the gut strings, resonated through the spruce and maple bodies he understood so intimately, and filled the sacred space around them. During a particularly poignant passage in a Bach cello suite, he reached for her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, and she felt the music not just in her ears, but as a current passing directly from him to her. It was a shared moment of beauty so intense it felt like a vow. With each encounter, another layer of her caution was stripped away. The trust between them was no longer a fragile, new thing, but a material with its own weight and substance. It was the smooth, cool feel of his hand in hers, the comfortable silence that could stretch between them for minutes at a time, the certainty that when she spoke of her strange, quiet passions, his eyes would light up with understanding, not glaze over with polite confusion. About 3 weeks after their first date, after she had finished the painstaking process of rebacking the Bible's spine with new leather, dyed to match the original, and was waiting for the adhesives to fully cure, he called her. "I'm making dinner on Friday," he said, his voice a warm rumble over the phone. "At my place, if you'd like to come." The invitation was simple, but Alara understood its significance. The workshop was his sacred space, but his home was his private one. It was a new threshold, a deeper level of intimacy. "I'd love that," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. His apartment was on the top floor of a converted warehouse in a part of the city that had once been industrial and was now a quiet, artsy enclave. The space was open and vast, with high ceilings crisscrossed by old wooden beams and enormous arched windows that looked out over the slumbering city. And it was, as she had suspected, an extension of everything she knew about him. It was not a sterile, modern space. It was a place that had been lived in, thoughtfully and with love. The furniture was a mix of sturdy, well-made pieces, a heavy oak dining table, a deeply worn leather armchair that looked like it had been molded to the shape of a human body over decades. Bookshelves, built by his own hands, she was sure, lined an entire wall, overflowing not just with books on music and woodworking, but with novels, poetry, and histories. A beautiful, dark-wooded cello, not a patient but his own, leaned in one corner like a sleeping person. The air smelled faintly of lemon oil and old wood. It felt less like a collection of objects and more like a carefully curated ecosystem of memory. "This is a beautiful space, Julian," she said, turning in a slow circle. "My grandfather and my dad converted it from a rope factory in the 70s, he said, coming to stand beside her. "My dad lived here until he passed. I've been here for the last 10 years. It's full of ghosts. Good ones." He showed her around, pointing out a ship in a bottle his grandfather had made, a series of framed, abstract black and white photographs his mother had taken. On a small table, there was a collection of his father's hand-carved pipes. He was sharing his lineage, the tangible pieces of the people who had shaped him. He was showing her the foundation on which he was built. He cooked with the same focused, unhurried grace with which he did everything else. He moved around the kitchen with an easy familiarity, chopping vegetables, stirring a risotto that filled the apartment with the scent of Parmesan and white wine. She sat at the heavy oak table, a glass of red wine in her hand, and watched him. He had given her the simple task of tearing basil leaves for the salad, and the scent that bloomed on her fingertips, sharp, green, and alive, felt like a perfect counterpoint to the dry, sweet smell of the old paper she was used to. They ate by the light of a few simple candles he'd lit on the table. The city glittered below them, a silent, jeweled carpet. The risotto was perfect, and the conversation was as warm and nourishing as the food. They talked more about their families. He told her stories of his father, a man who was as brilliant a craftsman as his grandfather, but gentler, quieter. "He was the one who taught me patience," Julian said, swirling the wine in his glass. "My grandfather taught me the rules of wood, the physics of it. But my dad taught me how to listen to it, how to wait for the instrument to tell you what it needs, not just impose your will on it." "I wish I'd known him," Alara said softly. "He would have loved you," Julian said simply, his eyes meeting hers across the table. "He would have loved what you do." He believed in honoring history. After dinner, they moved to the comfortable-looking sofa, and he put on a record, the low, melancholic tones of a Django Reinhardt guitar. The music filled the space, a smoky, intricate melody that seemed to suit the room perfectly. It was comfortable, domestic, and so profoundly peaceful that Alara felt a pang in her chest, a longing for something she hadn't even known she was missing. He had a small photo album on the coffee table, a simple leather-bound book, not unlike the ones she sometimes worked on. He opened it, and it was filled with old black and white pictures. A young man with Julian's eyes and a proud smile, holding a violin, his grandfather. A boy of about 7, with a gap-toothed grin and sawdust in his hair, standing next to a gentle-faced man, Julian and his father. And then, a photo of the three of them together, laughing in the workshop, 3 generations of craftsmen surrounded by the tools and the scent of their trade. That was the summer my grandfather taught me how to use a carving gouge, Julian said, pointing to the picture. I spent the whole afternoon making a pile of wood chips and one very lopsided-looking horse. My dad kept it on his workbench for years. Alara looked at the photograph, at the warmth and love that radiated from it. The easy, unself-conscious affection between the boy, his father, and his grandfather. The unbroken line. The sense of belonging, of a place in the world so solid and unquestionable it was like bedrock. And then, without warning, the floor gave way beneath her. A cold wave washed through her, so sudden and chilling it made her gasp. The warm, safe room seemed to recede, the music fading to a distant buzz. All she could see was that photograph, that image of a happy, intact family, and it was like a key turning in a locked, dark room deep inside her. The grief she kept so carefully packed away, insulated by routine and the quiet company of her books, suddenly broke free of its bindings. Her past wasn't a neatly shelved archive. It was a book with a shattered spine, its pages spilling out in a chaotic, painful jumble. She must have made a sound, or maybe the sudden tension in her body was as loud as a shout in the quiet room. Julian turned to her, his smile fading as he saw her face. Alara? What is it? Are you all right? She tried to speak, to form a simple, reassuring lie, but the words wouldn't come. Her throat was tight, her chest constricted. She could only shake her head, her eyes still fixed on the photograph. She felt a tear slide, hot and unwelcome, down her cheek. She quickly brushed it away, mortified. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. I don't have pictures like that. The confession hung in the air between them, small and devastating. It was the truest thing she had ever said to him, an unvarnished glimpse into the central, defining emptiness of her life. Julian didn't speak. He didn't offer platitudes or clumsy reassurances. He simply closed the photo album, his movements gentle and deliberate, and set it aside. Then he turned to her, his expression full of a deep, quiet empathy that was more comforting than any words could have been. He didn't try to touch her, didn't try to bridge the physical space between them. He gave her the room to breathe, to exist within her own sudden, sharp-edged sorrow. He just waited. He listened to her silence. After a long moment, she found her voice again. My parents, she began, the words feeling foreign and heavy in her mouth. They died when I was 7, in a car accident. I was with them. She stopped, the enormity of what she had left unsaid filling the room. The smell of burning metal, the sound of breaking glass, the sudden, terrible silence that followed. She didn't say any of that, but she could see in his eyes that he heard it anyway. I was raised by my grandmother, she continued, her gaze dropping to her hands, which were clenched tightly in her lap. She was wonderful, but she was from a different time. She didn't know how to talk about it. So we didn't. We just moved on. I spent a lot of time alone. In the library, books were safer. They have endings you can prepare for. And even when they're damaged, they can be mended. They don't just disappear. She finally looked up at him, her defenses completely gone, feeling as exposed as a book stripped of its covers. She expected to see pity in his eyes, or perhaps discomfort at this sudden, raw display of a grief he hadn't asked for. But what she saw was something else entirely. It was a profound, aching tenderness. He finally moved, shifting closer on the sofa. He reached out, not to hold her, but to gently unclench her hands, his own warm, strong fingers wrapping around hers. Thank you for telling me, he said, his voice a low, steady anchor in her swirling chaos. That was all. Not "I'm so sorry," not "that must have been so hard." Just "thank you." He was thanking her for the trust, for the gift of her vulnerability. He was honoring her scars, just as he would honor the crack in an old violin. He was making them strong, making them part of the story. The simple, profound acceptance in his voice broke the last of her restraint. A sob escaped her, a sound she hadn't made in years, and she leaned forward, pressing her face into his shoulder. And he held her. His arms came around her, solid and sure, and he just held her as the carefully constructed dam of 2 decades finally gave way. He didn't shush her, didn't pat her back. He was just a warm, breathing presence, a harbor in a storm she hadn't even known was still raging. He held her as if he had been built for that very purpose. When the storm finally subsided, leaving her feeling emptied and strangely calm, she was still wrapped in his arms, the rough texture of his sweater a comforting reality against her cheek. She could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart beneath her ear. "I'm sorry," she whispered against his chest. "I didn't mean to do that." "Never be sorry for that with me," he murmured into her hair. "Never." He held her for a long time, until the Django Reinhardt record had ended and the only sound was the quiet hum of the city outside the window. He didn't push her to talk more, didn't ask for details. He had been given a piece of her history, and he treated it with the reverence he would give any fragile, priceless object. He simply held it, and her, with infinite care. Later, much later, he led her to his bedroom. It was a simple room, dominated by a large bed with a frame of dark, heavy wood that he had almost certainly made himself. He didn't kiss her, not then. The intimacy that had just passed between them was deeper than a kiss. He just pulled back the covers and looked at her, a silent question in his eyes. She answered with a nod. Lying in the dark beside him, his arm a warm, heavy weight across her waist, his breath a gentle stir against the back of her neck, Alara felt a sense of peace so absolute it was almost dizzying. For the first time in her life, she was not alone with her ghosts. They were still there, but they were no longer her jailers. The silence in the room was not empty. It was full of his steady presence, a quiet, solid architecture of intimacy that had been built, piece by patient piece, to hold her. She woke just as the first gray light of dawn was beginning to filter through the large windows, turning the dark room into a landscape of soft shadows. Julian was still asleep, his face relaxed and peaceful. She watched the slow, even rise and fall of his chest. His hand was resting on the pillow near her head, the calloused fingertips and strong knuckles a testament to his life's work. A life of mending what was broken. Quietly, so as not to wake him, she slipped out of bed. She padded across the cool wood floor to the living room and stood before the window, looking out at the waking city. The sky was streaked with pale pink and violet. A new day was beginning. She turned and looked back at the room, at the ecosystem of his life, at the cello sleeping in the corner, the books that held 1,000 other worlds, the photographs that spoke of an unbroken love. And she didn't feel the cold emptiness of before. She felt a quiet sense of belonging. She had brought her own story into this space, with its broken binding and its water-stained pages, and it had not been rejected. It had been welcomed. It had been given a place on the shelf. She walked back into the bedroom, her heart calm and sure. Julian stirred as she slipped back under the covers. He opened his eyes, blinked sleepily, and then a slow, warm smile spread across his face. He drew her close, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was gentle and deep and full of the quiet promises of the morning. Later that day, back in her own workshop, the afternoon sun slanting through the window, she stood before her workbench. The Anderson Bible was ready for its final, crucial step, casing in. She carefully applied the final layer of paste to the end papers and lifted the heavy, recovered boards, positioning them perfectly against the text block. With practiced hands, she guided the book into the press, turning the heavy iron screw until it held the newly whole object in a firm, even embrace. She rested her hand on the cool metal of the press. The book would stay there for days, the pressure allowing all the separate elements, the paper, the thread, the cords, the boards, the leather, to become one unified, inseparable whole. It was no longer a collection of broken parts. It was a book again, strong and complete, its history honored, its future waiting. She looked at its new, sturdy spine, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt she understood exactly how it felt. Chapter 6. The Gilded Page. The pressure of the press, Alara knew, was not an act of violence, but of creation. It was a slow, insistent force that urged disparate parts towards a unified identity. For 3 days, the Anderson Bible sat within that firm embrace, and for 3 days, Alara felt a parallel, gentle pressure shaping her own life. The silence in her workshop, once a vast, echoing chamber of solitude, had been transformed. It was now a vessel, holding the resonance of Julian's presence even when he wasn't there. The memory of his voice, the feel of his hand, the scent of lemon oil and sawdust that clung faintly to her clothes after a night at his apartment. These were the new acoustics of her world. Their life together settled into a rhythm as natural and unhurried as the turning of seasons. It was a life built in the spaces between their work, a quiet architecture assembled from small, sturdy moments. There were evenings in his vast, high-ceilinged apartment where she would read on his worn leather armchair, the melancholic strum of a Django Reinhardt record filling the space, while he sat at his workbench, not restoring an instrument, but carving something small and whimsical, a bird, a leaf, a small, intricate knot of wood, for no other reason than the joy of it. There were mornings in her small, sun-filled apartment, where he would make coffee, grinding the beans by hand in an old brass mill that had belonged to his grandfather, the rhythmic crunching sound a gentle alarm clock. They learned the topography of each other's daily lives, the specific mug she preferred, the way he liked to arrange his tools before starting a project, the shared and sacred silence of intense concentration. One evening, while she was preparing a simple dinner of pasta and roasted vegetables in his kitchen, he came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. She was stirring the sauce, and he watched the movement of the wooden spoon, his gaze as focused as if he were watching the application of a final coat of varnish. "You have good hands," he murmured, his voice a low vibration against her back. "Steady, confident. You trust them." She leaned back into him, a small smile touching her lips. "It's the only part of me I've ever fully trusted." This new intimacy was a language they were both fluent in, a dialect of touch and shared space, of comfortable silences and unspoken understanding. It was in the way he would bring her a cup of tea in the workshop without asking, setting it on a coaster on the one clear corner of her workbench. It was in the way she would find herself tracing the lines on his palm, reading the story of his work in the calluses and faint, silvery scars. She was learning that love, in its most profound form, was not a grand, declarative symphony, but a quiet, intricate piece of chamber music, played perfectly in tune. On the 4th day, it was time. The Anderson Bible was ready to be released from the press. Alara approached the task with a sense of ceremony. The air in the workshop was still, thick with the scent of leather and old paper, the late afternoon sun casting long, golden shafts of light through the tall windows. She placed her hands on the cold, heavy iron of the screw and began to turn it. The sound was a deep, satisfying groan, the sound of release. She eased the press open and carefully slid the book out. It felt transformed. It was no longer a fragile artifact, but a solid, unified object. It lay heavy and balanced in her hands. The new spine was strong and flexible, the boards perfectly aligned. She ran her fingers over the dark, reconditioned leather of the cover. It was smooth and cool, the scars and blemishes of its long life not erased, but integrated, honored. It felt alive. Now came the final act, the one that would return the book's name and identity, the gilding. This was the most delicate part of the process, a marriage of heat, pressure, and the thinnest, most ethereal of all metals. She spent an hour setting up, arranging her finishing tools, brass stamps with letters and decorative elements, each set in a wooden handle, on a small electric stove. She laid out a small book of gold leaf, its pages as thin as whispers, interleaved with tissue. Julian had said he wanted to be there for this part. A text message arrived as if on cue. Asterisk on my way. Don't start the magic without me. Asterisk. When the bell over the door chimed, he found her hunched over the spine of the Bible, which was held securely in a finishing press. She was practicing on a scrap of leather, impressing a small, decorative fleuron. She looked up and smiled, a smudge of black ink on her cheek. You're just in time for the nerve-wracking part, she said. He didn't answer immediately. His eyes were fixed on the book in the press, his expression full of a reverence that went beyond his appreciation for her craft. This was his history, his family's story, reborn. He walked over and gently touched the cover, his fingers tracing the faint, dark water stain near the edge that she had chosen to leave, a part of its journey that could not, and should not, be erased. It looks, he started, his voice thick with emotion. It feels whole again, Alara. It always was, she replied softly. It just needed to be reminded of it. He pulled up a stool, content to watch, to be a silent, supportive presence. He understood the sanctity of this moment, the need for absolute focus. Alara's movements became a kind of ritual. She carefully cleaned the leather on the spine where the title would go, then painted the area with a thin, clear glaze made from egg white, called glare. This would act as tea, adhesive for the gold. She waited for it to dry to the perfect state of tackiness. The timing was everything. Too wet, and the gold would look smeared. Too dry, and it wouldn't adhere. She picked up the book of gold leaf. With a gilder's knife, she sliced off a small, impossibly thin rectangle of gold and picked it up with a pad of cotton lightly brushed with oil. The fragile square of metal seemed to float, shimmering in the lamplight, a captured piece of sun. With a surgeon's precision and a held breath, she laid it across the prepared section of the spine. She repeated the process until the entire area was covered in a delicate, crinkled blanket of gold. Now for the heat. She tested one of her finishing tools on a damp cloth. A satisfying hiss told her it was the right temperature. Too hot, and it would burn the leather. Too cool, and the impression would be weak. She selected the brass letters from her collection, spelling out HLY Bible, and arranged them in her palette, a tool that held the letters in a straight line. She heated the palette, took a deep, steadying breath, and pressed it firmly and squarely onto the gold-covered spine. She held it for a count of 3, the pressure even and constant. When she lifted the tool, the letters were impressed into the leather. She took a soft cotton cloth and gently brushed away the excess gold leaf. And there it was. The words shone from the dark leather, crisp and perfect, seeming not to be laid upon the surface, but to be emanating from within the book itself. Holy Bible. Julian let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. My God, Alara. She didn't look at him, her focus absolute. Next came the family name. She carefully set the letters, Anderson. She repeated the process, the heating, the steadying breath, the firm, even pressure. She brushed away the excess gold, and the second word appeared beneath the first, a declaration of ownership and lineage, a name now permanently bound to the sacred text. She worked for another hour, adding 5 simple, raised bands to the spine with a heated tool, giving it the classic, traditional structure. The final touch was a small, blind-tooled cross at the very bottom, an impression made with heat and pressure, but no gold, a quiet, humble symbol. Finally, she was done. She stepped back, her hands covered in gold dust, and looked at her work. The Bible was no longer Julian's damaged inheritance or her intricate project. It was itself a thing of beauty and strength, a testament to survival and restoration. It was ready to go home. She gently lifted it from the press and held it out to him. He took it with both hands, the way one receives a sacrament. He didn't speak for a long time. He just held it, turning it over, feeling its weight, its solidity. He opened the cover. The new end papers swirled with their pattern of blue and gold nebulae, a universe contained within. He turned the pages, listening to the soft, crisp rustle. He stopped at the family records section, at the pages filled with the elegant script of his great-grandmother, the strong, angular hand of his grandfather, the familiar, slightly rushed writing of his father. All the names were still there. The lineage was intact. When he finally looked up at her, his eyes were shining. "You didn't just fix it," he said, his voice quiet and rough with unshed tears. "You gave it back its voice, its soul. I just listened to what it needed," she whispered, echoing the words he had once said about his own work. He closed the book and placed it carefully on the workbench. Then he stepped forward and drew her into his arms, holding her tightly. He didn't say thank you. The words would have been too small. Instead, he simply held her, his hand stroking her hair, his body conveying a depth of gratitude that was more profound than any language. She buried her face in his shoulder, inhaling the familiar scent of him, feeling the fine, shimmering dust of gold leaf from her hands transfer to the back of his dark sweater. They were both marked by the work. That night, they took the Bible back to his apartment. It felt like a procession. He carried it carefully in a soft cloth bag she had made for it. He didn't put it on one of his overflowing bookshelves. Instead, he cleared a space on the mantelpiece, between a framed photograph of his parents on their wedding day and his grandfather's favorite hand-carved pipe. He placed the book there, upright, its newly gilded spine catching the warm light of the room. It looked as though it had been there for 100 years, and would be for 100 more. It had come home. They stood for a moment, looking at it, their shoulders touching. The completion of the project had changed the air between them. The book had been the vessel for their courtship, the blueprint for their intimacy. It was the tangible object that had brought their two quiet, focused worlds together. Now that its restoration was complete, it felt less like an ending and more like a beginning. The foundation had been built. Now, they had to decide what to build upon it. "You know," Julian said, his voice thoughtful as he gazed at the book, "there's a gathering at my aunt and uncle's house in 2 weeks. Up in the country. It's my cousin's anniversary. It's loud," he added with a slight, self-deprecating smile. "And chaotic. My whole family will be there. Aunts, uncles, dozens of cousins, little kids running everywhere. It's the opposite of this." He gestured around his peaceful, orderly apartment. "And the opposite of your workshop." He turned to look at her, his expression open and a little vulnerable. "I want you to come with me," he said. "I want to show them the Bible. But mostly, I want to show them you." Alara's heart gave a sudden, sharp thump against her ribs. This was a new threshold, a door opening onto a world far beyond the safe, curated spaces they had built for themselves. A family, not just a collection of names on a page, but living, breathing, laughing people. A web of connections, an unbroken lineage. The very thing she had never had. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. The old Alara, the girl who built fortresses of books to keep the world at bay, would have recoiled, would have found a polite, plausible excuse. But she wasn't that Alara anymore. The work she had done on the Anderson Bible, she realized, had also been done on her. The scattered signatures of her own life had been sewn together. The spine had been reinforced. She was no longer a collection of broken parts. She looked from the proud, steady Bible on the mantelpiece to the warm, steady man beside her. She saw the hope in his eyes, the quiet, earnest invitation. He wasn't just inviting her to a party. He was inviting her into his story, offering her a place within its pages. A slow smile spread across her face, genuine and unafraid. "I would love that," she said. And as she spoke the words, she felt the last, invisible binding around her own heart finally, irrevocably, give way. Later that night, lying beside him in the dark, listening to the slow, even rhythm of his breathing, Alara thought about her workbench. For the first time in months, the space where the Anderson Bible had rested was empty. It was a clean, clear space, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like a page waiting to be written on, a future waiting to be bound. The press stood silent in the corner, its work done, but she knew its lessons were permanent. She understood now that the strongest things in the world are not the things that are never broken, but the things that have been mended with patience and with love. And she knew, with a certainty that settled into the very marrow of her bones, that she was finally ready for the story to continue. Chapter 7. The Unwritten Page. The 2 weeks that followed the Bible's homecoming were a quiet exhalation, a slow release of pressure. The project that had been the central beam of their intersecting lives was now complete, and in its absence, they discovered the true shape of the structure they had built around it. The space on Alara's workbench, scrubbed clean of gold dust and leather shavings, was no longer the focal point of her workshop. Instead, the focus had shifted, subtly but irrevocably, to the space between them. It was a space filled with the easy cadence of domesticity. They cooked together in Julian's kitchen, a silent, practiced ballet of chopping and stirring. He learned to decipher her moods by the way she sharpened her paring knives. She learned the state of his soul by the music he chose to play. They took long walks as the autumn air grew crisp, their hands intertwined in the pocket of his coat, their conversations meandering from the philosophy of wood grain to the merits of different kinds of paper, finding the profound in the mundane. Alara found herself changing in small, seismic ways. The solitude she had once curated as a necessary defense now felt like a room she had outgrown. She began leaving the door to her workshop unlocked during the day. She found herself humming along to the jazz records Julian left playing in her apartment. One afternoon, looking at her reflection in the window, she was startled to see not a ghost haunting the edges of life, but a woman standing firmly in its center, her eyes clear, her mouth settled in a soft, unfamiliar curve of contentment. She was being rebound, not by thread and glue, but by 1,000 tiny moments of shared trust and unassuming love. The fear she had anticipated for the family gathering was a low, distant hum, not the screaming klaxon it once would have been. It was the nervousness of an actor before a premiere, not the terror of a soldier before a battle. Julian was her anchor in this. He didn't dismiss her anxiety with easy platitudes. Instead, he acknowledged it, made room for it. "They're a lot," he admitted the night before they were to leave, as they sat on the floor of his living room, surrounded by the organized chaos of a violin he was repairing. "They love fiercely, and they argue loudly, and they have no concept of personal space. They'll ask you a million questions, but all you have to do is be you. That's all I want." He picked up a small, perfectly shaped bridge he had just carved. "See this? Its only job is to transmit the vibration from the strings to the body of the instrument. It has to be strong and perfectly fitted and honest in its purpose. You're like that, Alara. You're my bridge. You connect the history I come from." He gestured vaguely towards the mantelpiece where the Bible stood, "to the future I want to build." The weight of his words, the simple poetry of his craftsman's heart, settled her more than any reassurance could have. He wasn't asking her to perform. He was asking her to connect. The drive north was a slow unfurling from the city's tight grid into the rolling, unwritten pages of the countryside. The gray geometry of buildings gave way to the sprawling, untidy prose of oak and maple trees, their leaves a fiery manuscript of crimson and gold. Julian drove with a relaxed competence, one hand on the wheel, the other often finding hers on the seat between them. He told her stories about the landscape they passed, stories of childhood summers spent fishing in a particular creek, of a gnarled old apple tree he'd fallen out of the small town where his great-grandfather had first set up his workshop. It was an oral history, a map of his lineage laid out upon the land, and Alara listened, absorbing it all, feeling the context of the man beside her taking on new dimension and depth. They turned onto a long, gravel driveway flanked by a rambling stone wall. At the end of it stood a house that looked as if it had grown organically from the hillside. It was a large, white-clapboard farmhouse with a deep, wraparound porch, mismatched shutters, and a plume of welcoming smoke curling from a stone chimney. It was not a pristine architectural statement. It was a living, breathing archive of a family's life, marked by additions, repairs, and the gentle wear of generations. Before they had even stopped the car, the front door burst open and a flood of life spilled out. Two small children chasing a frantic golden retriever, followed by a woman with flour on her apron and Julian's warm, brown eyes. The moment the car door opened, Alara was enveloped. The air smelled of wood smoke, roasting chicken, and damp earth. The sound was a symphony of chaos, shouting, laughter, the percussive thud of the screen door, the barking of the dog. Julian's aunt, Margaret, she learned, pulled Alara into a hug that was both startlingly strong and deeply comforting. "So you're the miracle worker," she exclaimed, her voice a warm, melodic boom. "Julian hasn't shut up about you for a month. We were beginning to think you were a mythical creature, like a unicorn who binds books. It is so wonderful to finally meet you. Come in, come in. You must be freezing." She was swept inside on a tide of introductions. There was Uncle Robert, a tall, quiet man with a formidable handshake and a face carved from the same thoughtful wood as his nephew. There were cousins, so many cousins, and their spouses and their children, a vibrant, swirling kaleidoscope of names and faces. It was overwhelming, a total sensory immersion. For a moment, the old Alara surfaced, the girl who wanted to shrink into a corner and build a wall of silence around herself. She felt like a specimen under glass, a rare, quiet bird introduced into a flock of brilliant, noisy parrots. But Julian was a constant, warm presence at her side. He kept a hand on the small of her back, a silent, steadying pressure. He guided her through the currents of conversation, translating the rapids of family in-jokes, anchoring her when she felt herself beginning to drift. She watched him with his family and saw a new facet of him. Here, he was not just the quiet, focused luthier. He was a nephew, a cousin, a godfather. He teased, he laughed, he effortlessly picked up a crying toddler and settled them on his hip, his large, skilled hands looking just as natural holding a child as they did a chisel. After an hour of circular mingling, Uncle Robert approached them, his expression serious. "Julian," he said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the surrounding chatter. "Margaret told me you brought it." A hush seemed to fall over their small corner of the room. The moment of presentation had arrived. Julian nodded and retrieved the cloth-wrapped book from his bag. The family began to gravitate towards them, forming a silent, expectant circle around the large oak dining table. Julian unwrapped the Bible and placed it in the center of the table. In the warm, domestic light of the room, it seemed to glow. The reconditioned leather was rich and dark, the new spine stood straight and proud, and the gilded letters caught the light, a quiet, certain proclamation, Holy Bible. "Anderson." Uncle Robert reached out a hand, then hesitated, as if afraid to touch it. He looked at Alara, his gaze direct and piercing. "This was my grandfather's," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "When my father gave it to Julian, it was coming apart. We thought its time was over. We thought it was just a collection of memories, and that the container was lost." He finally placed his hand on the cover, his broad, weathered fingers tracing the lines of the leather, the faint water stain she had preserved. He handled it not as an object, but as a revered elder. He opened it carefully. The new inn papers, with their celestial swirls, elicited a soft murmur of wonder from the onlookers. He turned to the family records, his finger moving down the list of names, the chronicle of his bloodline. "Look," he whispered, his voice cracking. He pointed to the final entry, the name of his own grandson, born just 6 months prior, which had been added in fresh ink by the baby's mother. The name was at the top of a new, clean page. "There is room," he said, looking around at the gathered family. "There is room for more." He looked up at Alara, and his eyes, so serious before, were shining with profound gratitude. "You didn't just mend a book, my dear," he said, his voice resonating with the weight of a patriarch's formal blessing. "You have ensured that our story can continue to be written. You have given this family back its heart." The room was silent for a beat, a silence filled with a century of shared history. And then Aunt Margaret started to clap, a slow, deliberate sound. Soon, the entire room joined in, a warm, heartfelt applause directed entirely at her. Alara felt a blush creep up her neck, a heat-born not of embarrassment, but of a feeling so new and overwhelming she couldn't immediately name it. It was the feeling of being seen, of being valued, of belonging. She looked at Julian, who was watching her with a smile of such love and pride that it took her breath away. In that moment, surrounded by the warm, chaotic embrace of his family, she understood. This was home. Later, as the evening deepened and the party settled into a comfortable rhythm of food and stories, Julian took her hand. "Come with me," he whispered. "I want to show you something." He led her out a back door, away from the warmth and the noise, into the cool, sharp air of the autumn night. The sky above was a vast, dark velvet, punctured by the brilliant, cold light of a million stars. The Milky Way was a shimmering path across the heavens, a celestial spine holding the universe together. He led her across a lawn damp with dew to a large, weathered barn that smelled of hay and old wood and time. He slid open the heavy door and flicked on a single, bare bulb that hung from a high rafter. The space was cavernous, filled with the ghosts of harvests past. But against one wall was a long, sturdy workbench, far older and more rustic than his own. It was covered in wood shavings and half-finished projects. Hanging from pegs on the wall were old, hand-forged tools, planes, saws, and chisels, their wooden handles worn smooth by the grip of generations. "This was my great-grandfather's workshop," Julian said softly, his voice reverent in the quiet space. "Then my grandfather's. It's where I first learned. My uncle keeps it just as my grandfather left it." He ran his hand along the surface of the bench, a surface scarred with the marks of countless projects, a physical record of a lifetime of creation. "My grandfather used to say that a craftsman's legacy isn't in the things he finishes, but in the skills he passes on. The chair breaks, the violin gets sold, the book's pages turn to dust. But the knowledge of how to build, how to mend, that's the thing that can last." He turned to face her, the single bulb casting long shadows around them, making the barn feel like a sacred space. "What you did with that Bible, Alara, it wasn't just a repair. It was a continuation. You took all your knowledge, all your skill, all your quiet, patient heart, and you wove it into the fabric of my family's history. You've become part of the story." He stepped closer, taking both of her hands in his. They were cold from the night air. He warmed them between his own. "The Bible project is finished. It brought us together, and I will be grateful for it every day of my life. But I don't want our story to end there. I don't want to just be a chapter in your life, and I don't want you to just be a chapter in mine." He looked directly into her eyes, his own earnest and clear. "I want to write the rest of the book with you. I want to build a life with you, Alara. Not restore something old, but create something entirely new. Something with a strong spine and room for new pages, and a story that we get to write together every day." He wasn't kneeling, there was no ring, but this was more real, more profound than any grand gesture. It was a craftsman's proposal, honest, solid, and built to last. It was an invitation to take the clean, empty pages of their futures and bind them together. Tears she hadn't realized were forming welled in her eyes, not of sadness or fear, but of a joy so profound it was almost painful. For her entire life, she had been the careful conservator of other people's stories, preserving their pasts, honoring their legacies. She had never dared to imagine she could be a protagonist in her own. She had been content to be the epilogue, the addendum, the careful footnote. But Julian was offering her the title page. For so long, she said, her voice a near whisper, I thought my story was about what was broken, about what was missing. My job was to fix things because I felt irreparable myself. She looked from his face to the old workbench, to the legacy of skill and love it represented. You didn't fix me, Julian. You showed me that I was never broken to begin with, just unbound. A slow, brilliant smile broke across her face, chasing away the last of the shadows. Yes, she breathed, the word a release, a promise, an opening line. Yes, I want to write that book with you. He closed the small distance between them and kissed her. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of deep, settled certainty. It was a promise sealed, a commitment made. In the quiet of the old barn, surrounded by the tools and the scent of 100 years of patient work, their future was commissioned. They walked back to the house hand in hand, the chill of the night unable to touch the warmth that radiated between them. When they stepped back into the bright, noisy chaos of the party, it no longer felt overwhelming. It felt like a chorus, and she was finally ready to add her voice to it. Aunt Margaret pressed a slice of apple pie into her hand, and Uncle Robert engaged her in a quiet, serious conversation about the archival properties of different kinds of paper, and a small cousin tugged on her sleeve, asking her to read a story. She was no longer an observer. She was a participant. She was family. The drive home, much later that night, was quiet and peaceful. The roads were empty, and the car moved through the dark landscape like a needle stitching the night together. Alara leaned her head against the passenger window, watching the world slide by, feeling the thrum of the engine, the steady presence of Julian beside her. The Bible was back in its place on the mantelpiece in the country, but its absence in the car didn't feel like a loss. Its work was done. When they finally arrived back at her apartment building in the pre-dawn stillness of the city, they were both tired, but it was a deep, satisfying exhaustion. He walked her to her door, the way he always did. I have a commission for you, he said, his voice soft in the quiet hallway. She raised an eyebrow. Oh, is one of your violins in need of a new case? No, he smiled. It's a new book. Blank pages. The finest paper you can find. A simple leather binding. No title on the spine. A journal? She asked. An atlas, he corrected gently. For mapping out a new world. Our world. He leaned in and kissed her forehead. Good night, Alara. She went inside and walked through her quiet apartment, her home. But it looked different, felt different. It was no longer a fortress or a hermitage. It was simply a starting point. She walked into her workshop. The moon cast a silver rectangle of light across the floor. Her tools lay in their neat, orderly rows. The press stood silent in the corner. Her gaze fell upon the large, empty space on her workbench where the Anderson Bible had rested for so many weeks. For the first time, an empty space did not signify an absence or a loss. It was not a void to be feared. It was potential. It was a promise. It was a clean, well-pressed sheet, waiting for the first line of a new story. Their story. And Alara, the quiet girl who had spent her life mending the endings of others, was finally, thrillingly, ready to begin. Alara's journey is a beautiful reminder that sometimes the most profound miracles happen not when we try to control every detail, but when we finally surrender. When we place our deepest desires and our unwritten pages into God's hands, He can author a love story more perfect than we could ever dream of. Thank you so much for joining us for this story of faith and mended hearts. If Alara and Julian's story touched your heart, please subscribe to the Prayer Miracles channel for more inspiring tales of hope and divine intervention. Don't forget to click the bell so you never miss a new story that strengthens your faith.